Our American President's Life Portrait Series continues the last 2 weeks of 1999 with a look at each one of the 41 men who've been President of the United States. Up next, a visit to Stanton, Virginia, and the birthplace home of the nation's 28th President, Woodrow Wilson. Earlier this year, we met with Wilson historians John Milton Cooper and Nell Irvin Painter about the former president's life and times. The program lasts about 3 hours and begins with a brief video biography chronicling his life.
For beauty, I am not a star. There are others more handsome by far, but my face I don't mind it, for I am behind it. It's the people in front that I jar.
Thomas Woodrow Wilson was born December 28, 1856 in Stanton, Virginia, but raised both in Augusta, Georgia and Columbia, South Carolina.
My first recollection is of standing at my father's gateway in Augusta, Georgia, when I was 4 years old, and hearing someone pass and say that Mr. Lincoln was elected, and there was to be a war.
When Wilson left the South as a young man, he dropped the Thomas from his name. From a young age, he expressed an interest in politics, but didn't hold public office until 1911, when at the age of 55, he became the governor of New Jersey. In the early part of the century, Wilson was thought of as reform-minded and progressive. He spent the majority of his professional life first as a professor and later as the president of Princeton University. He insisted on the highest of academic standards and once told the distraught father of a boy who failed the entrance exam, if the angel Gabriel applied for admissions to Princeton University and could not pass the entrance examinations, he would not be admitted. A devout Presbyterian, Wilson believed strongly in religious destiny. After delegates at the Democratic National Convention nominated him in 1912, he told an office-seeking campaign worker that he would not repay him with the job. God ordained that I should be the next president of the United States, Wilson explained to the man. His first term began on March 4, 1913. World War I plagued Wilson. He promoted a policy of cautious neutrality, and during his re-election campaign in 1916, his slogan became, "He kept us out of war." On April 2, 1917, however, Wilson in his second term asked Congress permission to declare war on Germany. Wilson became the first sitting president to travel to Europe. In December of 1918, he boarded the SS George Washington en route to Paris for the Paris Peace Conference. 2 months after he returned, he embarked on a national speaking tour to endorse his creation, the League of Nations, for which he later won the Nobel Peace Prize. After 3 weeks, Wilson had a physical breakdown and returned to Washington, where he subsequently suffered a stroke. The extent of Wilson's illness was kept from the press. His second wife, Edith, whom he married in 1915, acted as a buffer between his advisors and the president. Even after his health improved, in 1920, Edith continued her supervisory role. A reporter said that Edith was the finest argument for suffrage. Wilson and his first wife, Ellen, had been married for 29 years. While a housekeeper at the White House had proclaimed her a daydreamer, she was considered by many to have been Wilson's closest confidant. In a letter to President Taft, she wrote, "I am naturally the most unambitious of women, and life in the White House has no attractions for me." Nevertheless, her small and simple dinner parties were considered a success, and her devotion to humanitarian causes was greeted with admiration. She died of Bright's disease on August 6, 1914. They had 3 daughters together. On March 4, 1921, he rode with his successor, Warren G. Harding, to the Capitol for his inaugural. But he didn't stay for the ceremonies. Instead, he retired to a home on S Street in Washington, where he practiced law and spoke out in favor of the League of Nations for the remainder of his life. He died on February 3, 1924, soon after his final public address.
I am not one of those that have the least anxiety about the triumph of the principles I have stood for. I have seen fools resist providence before, and I have seen their destruction, as will come upon these again, utter destruction and contempt. That we shall prevail is as sure as that God reigns.
From shore to shore we sorrow for those who forever sleep. With sadness and sighs we turn our eyes to one who our honor will keep. fathers before us. We're here to dare and do for our country's cause and right. If we must, then we will fight. Mr. Wilson, we're with you.
A song by the Ovation Singers here in Stanton, Virginia. We're all with you, Mr. Wilson. When President Woodrow Wilson returned from the Paris Peace Conference, a brand new White House limousine picked him up. That was July of 1919. Today, that very limousine, which you see here, is on display right here in Stanton, Virginia at Woodrow Wilson's birthplace and museum. In the car right now, and you'll meet him here in just a second, is Dick Robertson. Good morning, Mr. Robertson.
Good morning, Brian.
What is this car all about?
Well, it's all about one of the greatest presidents the country ever had. And it was built in 1919, and it has some amazing features.
Nice to see you. What year? 1919.
1919, yes.
And a car like this in those days cost how much money?
Well, about $6,500. But 5 of his Princeton friends pooled their money, and for $3,500, they presented it to him as a gift when he left the White House.
Including that orange stripe right there on
Indeed.
the side. Who put that on there?
Well, he had that done. He was president of Princeton, thought that was appropriate.
You got a seal of the president on the door. What's
Indeed.
special inside this car?
Well, just about everything. The upholstery was done by a local artisan, and she's a lady, and she does great work.
How did you get involved?
Well, the car came on hard times in 1989. The engine exploded and seized and so forth, and we undertook a complete restoration. And when we were finished, we were invited to bring the car out to Pebble Beach, the concours d'elegance, the best in the world, and we were very proud of that.
How many people spend some of their lives worrying about this?
Well, there's about 7 of us on the committee, and we keep the car alive and well. Something's wrong, we fix it now instead of getting a laundry list of things to do.
Dick Robertson, thank you for introducing us to the White House limousine.
Thank you, Brian.
28th President of the United States will be here for the next 3 hours, and John Milton Cooper and Nell Painter are going to help tell us all about this man. John Milton Cooper went to Princeton, and he's on our set down below the house here. Give us some of the health history to start off with of Woodrow Wilson. I'm surprised to find out that he had a couple of strokes before he got in the White House, John Milton Cooper.
Wilson had a kind of pre-stroke history, maybe some small strokes.
Oh.
These prefigure the major stroke. It affected him. What you have is a kind of gradual decline in his powers, and he keeps rallying back and then has that huge stroke right after the tour, when he went out on that speaking tour in 1920. And that produced, frankly, the worst crisis of presidential disability we've ever had.
You know, from time to time when you're reading the history of your books or Nell Painter's books, you see that health was a problem in his youth. From time to time, he had to take time off. Nell Painter, did you do any research on that?
No, I'm sorry, I didn't. I don't know very much about Wilson before he becomes president, or certainly before he gets to Princeton.
And now you teach at Princeton.
Yes, I do.
So we better be careful. This is a very Princeton program.
That's right. I didn't wear my Princeton tie.
Tell us what you think of Woodrow Wilson.
I think Woodrow Wilson, okay, I'm going to speak as a historian. Woodrow Wilson is a two-faced figure. On the one hand, he had the greatness and the intellectual stature to take the United States to a new world stage. But on the other hand, he also was a person of his time and his background. He was a Southerner, he was a white Southerner, he was a person who'd come of age in the 19th century, and he drug his feet on women's suffrage and women's issues, what we now call feminism, and he was retrograde when it came to race relations. When he became president, race relations were very much in flux, and he and his Postmaster General really set things back in terms of segregating the federal workforce and of sort of setting a white Southern tone.
We're going to have our phones open immediately, as we always do, and expect our audience to bring us the good questions that you have throughout this series. We're at the 28th president's birthplace. How long did he live here?
About a year and a half. His father was a Presbyterian minister. He'd been here for about 3 or 4 years. Wilson was born here. He got another church down in Augusta, Georgia, and they moved on.
How much of a Southerner was he?
I disagree with Nell a bit there.
Really?
His parents came from Ohio. They'd only been in the South for about 4 or 5 years. His mother actually was born in England, and his grandfathers were Scottish. So that he's actually the most ethnic president we've had. He's the only president we've had since Andrew Jackson who had no American-born grandparents and had a foreign-born parent. I think I don't disagree with Nell on his racial views, but I see them more as almost more like a Northerner than a Southerner of that time, which says they're still bad, but he's not the rabid racist.
He was deep-dyed in Princeton as well. Princeton was always considered the southernmost northern college, or the northernmost southern college.
Either way, yeah.
So he could have been acting out of his feelings of just being an upper class or an upper middle class white American at the time. But I do think that there was something profoundly southern in his way of dealing with upstarts, and I mean, a kind of southern conservatism, if you wish.
What year was he born?
Right at the end of 1856, almost 1857. It's December 26, 1856.
What did his father do?
Presbyterian minister. Had different churches here in Stanton, Augusta, Georgia. Then he was on the faculty of the Columbia Theological Seminary in Columbia, South Carolina. Then he had a church in Wilmington, North Carolina, eventually wound up in Tennessee.
How did you come to be interested in him?
Very gradually. It was not at Princeton. It was later on. I got interested in World War I, and once you get into that era, you're drawn into Wilson. You simply can't help studying it.
And Nell Painter, how did you get involved?
Very similar. I was working on a history of the United States in late 19th and early 20th century, and unlike Professor Cooper, I have not been deep-dyed in Wilson work or in the primary sources. So I was really trying to make sense of the United States as a whole. And I came into Wilson initially thinking I would get to him with the European War, but found that I was involved with him in terms of his governorship because of what was going on in New Jersey being a very forward state in business terms, corporations and so forth, and as a progressive, and then with the Mexican Revolution.
Let's go to phones. New York City, our first call for this segment. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning. I want to clarify something I heard once about Wilson. Actually, I'll tell you where I heard from it. On the public broadcasting show, The American Experience, they did a segment on the influenza plague they had right before and during the First World War, where during that period of time, over the world, over 30 million people died. And they made a statement in there that they knew the disease had to be quarantined, and that during the First World War, that Pershing was pushing Wilson to send more troops, and that they sent troops on ships over there, knowing full well that a good percentage of the troops would be dead by the time they arrived, because a lot of them had influenza, and by the time they got to the war, they were dying of influenza. And he knew that, and still sent these men to their death by influenza.
Professor Cooper, is that true?
That's news to me. I'd never heard that before. The flu was very ill understood. In fact, they didn't even isolate the virus or develop a vaccine for that particular strain of flu till the 1930s. And it was a strange killer. So I'd love to hear more about that. I've never heard that before.
Next call, Barberton, Ohio. You're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Brian, I think this is one of the best series on the television. My topic and questions have to do with Pancho Villa's raid into New Mexico in the 1916-17 Mexican expedition under the command of Black Jack Pershing.
Yeah.
I got three relatives that were in it, a grandfather, a great-uncle, and their brother-in-law, who was a National Guard recruiter in 1915. And I have some of my grandmother's memorabilia and pictures of the men in uniforms and their artillery pieces. They were part of the Battery B, 1st Battalion, Ohio Field Artillery, the Ohio National Guard. I had did a lot of reading on this, and I understand that the Army used the Mexican punitive expedition as a dress rehearsal for World War I, because they wanted to try out new concepts in motorized transport to replace their horses and mules, observation aircraft. Pancho Villa also had use of a couple of those. New radios, new weapons, and the first troop movements by train since the Spanish-American. They wanted to get the kinks out of their system because they were already preparing for World War I, even though I understand President Wilson was publicly making statements about staying out of war. I was wondering, did he privately agree with the War Department to start preparations?
No, Painter?
I don't know. I don't think there's any sort of conspiracy going on here. And my sense is, in reading about the way the two wars were going with each other, that I think Wilson was seriously prosecuting the, shall we call it a war, the hostilities with Mexico, kind of on a case-by-case basis. It was changing every few months. And so Francisco Villa's position was much stronger vis-a-vis the United States earlier on. And by the time the caller is talking about, and we have Villa's rates, he really has been very much diminished and is no longer considered a really serious figure in terms of saving Mexico or reimposing any kind of order in Mexico. So it's an evolving situation.
Professor Cooper, go back just a moment. He taught college in how many places?
3. Bryn Mawr, Wesleyan, and Princeton.
How long did he teach at Princeton?
12 years till he became president, and then another 8 years as president, so 20 years.
Roughly what year did he become president?
1902.
How long was he president at Princeton?
8 years.
What do you think they saw in him at that time, and did Grover Cleveland have anything to do with him coming on as president?
Grover Cleveland, I think, was on the Board of Trustees by that point. Wilson was the unanimous choice of the Princeton Board of Trustees. He was the most popular professor at Princeton. He was regarded as a real intellectual star. Interestingly enough, despite the fact that there's later a lot of conflict under his Princeton presidency, he was regarded very much as a unifying figure, somebody who was acceptable to everybody.
And then he became governor of New Jersey. How did that happen?
Well, what the Princeton presidency did for him was to reignite, or at least make the possibility of going into politics. That's what he originally wanted to do as a boy. Young man, he dreamed of going into politics and then given that up for academic life. But the Princeton presidency gave him public visibility. And there were some conservative Democrats in New York City who wanted, they wanted their star to try to take over the party, and several of them saw that in Wilson, so they sponsored him. It's ironic, they sponsored him, but already he was becoming a progressive, so that he used them. I mean, he's opportunistic. He used them to get the nomination, to get the governorship, and then dumped them.
If you've never been to Stanton, Virginia, we're right in the middle of the city. Coulter Street, which is very busy, is behind us. Frederick Street over here to the right. Mary Baldwin College is not more than a stone's throw up there on the hillside. As we take another call from Louisville, Kentucky. You're on the air. Go ahead, please. Hello, Louisville. You're on the air.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I guess I have a basic question about Wilson's domestic and foreign policy. Didn't he really sign in the first income tax law under the new constitutional amendment? And wouldn't that, we don't have a lot to thank him for that. And then on the international situation, he basically botched the neutrality claim that we were going to be neutral in the World War I, and got us into the war, which basically cost 100,000 American lives when we really had no vital national interest there.
Okay, thanks. Nell Panner?
Well, golly, I don't know where to start there. I think that, I mean, I find it very ironic that here I'm going to be defending Woodrow Wilson. But I think Woodrow Wilson was really quite honest in reflecting public opinion of people who did not want to be in the European war. The war just struck Americans, most Americans, as absolute folly in 1914, as senseless slaughter in 1915. By 1915, 1916 or so, we began to have Americans dividing between the forces of preparedness and the forces of peace. But certainly, when the war broke out and in the very early moments, Wilson was at one with the American people in wanting to keep this away. The United States got into what we now call the First World War, what they then called the European War, because it couldn't be helped.
Income tax. Professor Cooper.
The income tax is very popular in those days. In fact, it was an idea whose time had come.
Definitely.
And there's been a sea change, at least in a lot of people's attitude toward income taxes. The reason Wilson was able to put the income tax through is they'd amended the Constitution. The 16th Amendment to the Constitution is what allows income taxes. It was to overturn a Supreme Court decision.
Long Island, New York, you're up for our next caller. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
I would like to offer, as an academic exercise, this argument about Wilson, since most people consider Wilson to be a great man. I don't know if you people remember, maybe I'm a little older than you are, but there was a movie made by Daryl Zanuck, in the 1940s with Alexander Knox called Wilson. And in that movie, they blamed the Republican Party for the problems of Wilson, and they blamed the European leaders, Clemenceau Orlando and Lloyd George, for destroying his view. Now, here's my criticism. I think that as a university professor, he was somewhat narrow. I know he was president of Princeton. I know he was governor of New Jersey, but I really don't believe that he had that much practical view of the world. Now, this is what I believe that he was not viewing and was going ahead with his idealistic 14 points without taking these things into consideration.
Okay, sir, thanks. Let me ask Dr. Cooper to respond to you.
The reporters used to ask him that question when he was first in politics, both as governor and president, and they put it this way: hey, Doc, how come is it that an ivory tower academic like you does so well? The fact is, Wilson was an extremely successful president and a very good politician. And interestingly enough, Winston Churchill said after the peace conference, he said, what was amazing about Wilson was not how little he got of the 14 points in the peace treaty, but how much he got in there.
When did he propose the 14 points?
January 1918.
Give us a couple of them.
Open covenants of peace openly arrived at, freedom of the seas, a general association of nations, disarmament, eliminating trade barriers.
Self-determination?
Self-determination. Actually, he didn't use that phrase.
Oh.
No, Lloyd George did that. Another phrase he never used was war to end all wars. That's Lloyd George, too. Wilson had a much more limited idea of it. He did not, and never did propose self-determination as a general principle.
Did he promise not to send American boys to fight in a foreign war?
Not that I know of.
Never made that promise?
No.
In fact, they had a campaign slogan, the Democrats had a campaign slogan in 1916, he kept us out of war. Wilson never liked that. In fact, he said to one of his cabinet members, he said, I can't keep this country out of war. He said, any damned little German lieutenant could get us in there through a calculated outrage. What he meant was a submarine could do it. No, he used the peace theme. There's no question about that. He profited from it, but he was very limited and careful in that.
Dr. Painter, what are you teaching now at Princeton?
Actually, my last two courses were on whiteness and on beauty.
And
great subjects.
And how long have you been there?
I've been there about 10 years.
Dr. Cooper, you're at University of Wisconsin.
That's correct.
29 years?
29 years.
What do you teach?
I teach this period of American history. I teach courses on foreign policy. I do some stuff on Southern history.
We go to Garden Grove, California next. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Brian, thanks so much for taking my call, and thanks so much for C-SPAN.
Welcome.
On Book Notes a couple years ago, you had an author in a book that you reviewed called Lies My Teacher Told Me, and Woodrow Wilson kind of figured prominently in that. I read the book after watching Book Notes, and there was a lot of discussion about all of the military engagements that Wilson had gotten the United States entangled in. Something like over 50 times he committed U.S. troops to different conflicts, especially in South and Central America. And I was just wondering if your guest could comment on that and just kind of where he stands as far as being, just how militaristic was he for the man who thought of the League of Nations?
Nell Painter.
The caller makes a very good point that on the one hand, even though he may not have used the word self-determination, certainly one of his ideals was that people should govern themselves. Yeah. I think his sense was self-government within a larger framework. But the point is that Wilson did use military force in Mexico, in Haiti, in the Dominican Republic, and in Nicaragua. But this was not Wilson acting in some Wilsonian way. This was the way American, I don't know if they'd even call it foreign policy at that point. I mean, this was the backyard. And this was one of the sticking points when it came to the League of Nations, because American politicians wanted to keep that freedom of maneuverability for American politics, businessmen, military, whatever, within the Western Hemisphere.
If you've just joined us, we're in Stanton, Virginia, which is about a 3-hour drive from Washington, D.C. south. It's probably, what, an hour and something from Richmond?
Yeah, I think so.
We have some video we're going to show you of Woodrow Wilson back at the time when he was president, making some I don't know what you would say, introductions to some senators around the White House. on the screen right there. Let me ask Dr. Cooper about how tall was this man?
5'10".
What did he sound like, you think?
He sounded like a very, very fine Presbyterian minister. Say, the minister of the Riverside Church in New York or the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church in Washington. He didn't have a Southern accent. Partly because he trained his voice, and I think also because his parents were from Ohio. And when he was a boy, he lived in a rather insular little world, the world of the Presbyterian clergy. So he's a beautiful speaker.
What would he have been like to know as a person?
A lot of people liked him very much. He had a number of close friends. Many of his closest friends, in fact, were women. He enjoyed very much the company of educated, interesting women. So a lot of people liked him.
We're going to go to Denniston, Texas next. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Good morning. The one thing I got to tell you, of the presidents of this country, Woodrow Wilson is my least favorite. I think of him as a racist. I think he divided the country at the time. I think he was a snob. I think he was arrogant. He did nothing for this country except get us into a war that ended up into another war. And I got to tell you, of all the presidents in the country that we have ever had, he is the most evil. I mean,
let me ask you, caller, then, who would have been one of your favorites over the years?
Probably Teddy Roosevelt, because he was a pretty rounded man. I liked Franklin Roosevelt, and Abraham Lincoln, George Washington. But I guess my favorite, the one I'd really like to talk to, would have been probably T.R., because he did everything.
Okay, thank you. Let me ask Nell Painter about the racist.
Well, we're laughing here because if you take Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt, you'd have a lot of difficulty keeping them apart. Yeah. In sort of day-to-day practical terms. Now, it's true.
I think we can prove it here because Dr. Cooper's written a book
That's right.
called The Warrior and the Priest, and it parallels their two careers. Go ahead.
So when I started working on Standing at Armageddon and learning about, I came to Woodrow Wilson with much the same feeling as the caller, that he was not at all my favorite person and he sort of stood for evil. But learning more about the time and about the constraints, actually, on Wilson, I saw much more of Wilson. So I still see Wilson as a racist, but I also see much, much more. And so, for instance, if we'd had someone like, say, William Jennings Bryan as president, taking us into the First World War, it would have been a disaster. Even though, as a person, I think I like Bryan rather better. However, Bryan was also no friend to black people.
Dr. Cooper, a snob, arrogant.
Nope, doesn't
None of
work.
that?
Doesn't work. He's a very friendly fellow, like all kinds of people and all kinds
Well,
of...
not all kinds of people.
Well, okay, sorry. So you're right, Nell. There are... on the personal level, and here I think you're right that he is a Southerner. He had the kind of kindly relations.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
sure.
I'm not quarreling with that. Although, I couldn't. But in terms of most people, I got along with them fine.
North Las Vegas, Nevada. Good morning.
Morning. How are you all this morning?
Welcome.
Thank you very much. Dr. Cooper, you mentioned that the 16th Amendment conferred a new authority for the Income Tax Act of October 3rd of 1913. If you had bothered to read Baltic Mining, you would have read plainly that the Supreme Court stated the 16th Amendment did not confer any new authority upon the Congress for the imposing of the income tax. And I'm amazed that neither of you have mentioned the diplomatic communique signed on March 15th of 1915 by the President's advisor with Lloyd Asquith in London, guaranteeing and ensuring the integrity of the British Empire 2 years before the Declaration of War of April 7th. That is absolutely amazing.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Let me answer that one. First of all, I'll have to go back and look at those cases. But if you didn't need... the Supreme Court cannot overturn an amendment, and specifically, that's what the 16th Amendment did. Now, what you're referring to, actually, you've got your date wrong. That is not March 4th, 1915. It was early March 1916. It is a document known as the House Gray Memorandum, in which Wilson's, I think, somewhat underhanded and devious advisor and agent Colonel House was trying to cook up a deal to try to mediate the war and bring the United States in afterward. Wilson never fully endorsed that, and the British never bought it either.
St. Paul, Minnesota next. Go ahead, please.
First, I'd like to thank C-SPAN for this opportunity. I'd like to know if it would be incorrect to say that President Wilson's second wife was so involved towards the end of his term that she could be considered our first female president. And I'd also like to know why Thomas Marshall, his vice president, who had served for 2 terms, did not receive the nomination when Wilson's term was up. Would seem to me to be sort of a slap in the face not to, having been in there for 2 terms, not succeeded to the presidential nomination.
Thanks, caller. Nell Painter.
Well, I hesitate here to think of Mrs. Wilson as sort of Hillary Clinton in a way, but I think there is something to it. It's not exactly clear how much she was running the presidency after the president's strokes, but it's clear that she was doing a lot.
Talking about Edith Galt.
Yes, and I think that she has not been recognized for that. I think partly because of the constraints of femininity. If you were going to remain a feminine person, you couldn't exercise power in that way. And if you were not to be feminine, you couldn't be taken seriously as a woman at that time.
Let me ask Dr. Cooper to step back and go through as much as you can on his relationships with women, starting with his first cousin here in this town.
He, when he was a law student at UVA, he courted his cousin Hattie Woodrow, who was a student here at what was then called Augusta Female Seminary, now Mary Baldwin College. Proposed marriage to her. She turned him down. That was that. Then about 2 years later, when he was a young lawyer in Georgia, he met Ellen Axon, who was the daughter of a Presbyterian minister. They fell in love with each other. This was really the great love affair of Wilson's life. It was a very happy marriage, although Ellen suffered from depression. She had bouts of depression. That ran in the family. There was one extramarital liaison that he had. We don't know to this day whether it was actually a physically consummated affair with a woman named Mrs. Peck. This was late in Wilson's Princeton presidency. Ellen, I think, handled it very well. The marriage was patched up and continued very happily until she died right about the time of the outbreak of the First World War. About 6 months after her death, he met Edith Galt, who was a widow, owned the famous jewelry store Galt's in Washington. She was the widow of the founder of Galt's. Whirlwind courtship, and he married her in December 1915. So that's his marital history.
And he was married again to Ellen for how many years?
32 years.
And he was married then to Edith for how many years?
From 1915 until his death, so that would be 8 years.
And how long did she survive him?
Till 1961.
It's amazing, isn't it?
She died on the day that they dedicated, December 1961, the day they dedicated the Woodrow Wilson Bridge in Washington. She was supposed to be there at the ceremony, and what they say around the Wilson House in Washington is that she held on long enough to be there in spirit anyway for the dedication.
And those of us that live in Washington hear about the Woodrow Wilson Bridge every day of our lives. Bradenton, Florida, go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning. I would like to say that we had the privilege of one of our closest family friends throughout his life, the Pulitzer Prize winner, Arthur Walworth, and he won his prize on his book of Woodrow Wilson. So as a result of the many hours of discussion and admiration, he is certainly the president I admire most. I would like to add that as a result of this presidential series, my grandchildren who are being homeschooled surprised me on a weekly dinner visit after dinner. She waited until after dinner. My youngest granddaughter, Catherine, said, "Mooey, I would like to name the presidents." So therefore she stood and named all the presidents in order perfectly, and then she did it backwards. So thank you very much. There are many things that are surprising, and we're so happy about this series. But I do admire Woodrow Wilson the most of any president we've had for a lot of reasons. Thank you so much.
Why? Yes, why?
Caller?
Yes?
Why do you admire him?
Because, first of all, one of the things, I visited his home, of course, and as recently as last month, 2 months ago, his background of the way he was raised, the things that he so strongly believed in, and I really do believe that his attempt at the League of Nations was one of the finest things and the beginning of this worldwide community of brotherhood that we all need to work towards.
Thanks. And what would you say to...
I think the caller has picked up on the finest parts of Woodrow Wilson, but as I was saying to the woman who said that she hated Woodrow Wilson, there's a whole lot more.
What do you dislike about him the most?
Well, there's the narrowness, the racism, the sexism, you know, the sort of rigidity.
Was he an anti-Semite?
No, one of his closest friends was Bernard Baruch.
Well, it doesn't... that doesn't necessarily clear him. Well. But at any rate, I will not call him an anti-Semite. But there was that narrowness, that rigidity, that...
What was a Presbyterian in 1912? I mean, what was that church about? And were there any blacks that belonged to the Presbyterian Church?
Sure. There are black people everywhere. There were black Episcopalians. There are black Catholics. You know, there are black everybody's. But I'm thinking not so much in terms of his personal relationships, but rather his policies. So that, I think, is the weaker side of Woodrow Wilson. But what I do admire about Woodrow Wilson, which our caller picked up on, was that he had the stature and he had the intellectual strength to see beyond the politics right around him. In a sense, that was one of his weaknesses because he didn't have the give and take to make things possible.
We are in Stanton, Virginia, and we're talking about the 28th President of the United States, one of the, 11 or 12 presidents in our history that have actually completed 2 full terms in office. And we're going to talk more about how he was elected, what the election of 1912 was like after we take this call from Florida. What's the name of your city in Florida?
This is Yalaha, the mountainous area of Florida. Good work, Brian. Keep it up. I'm interested in Wilson's, how he would accept the 2 other Democrats that followed him, Lyndon Johnson's theft of the Social Security Trust to pay for a war, and Jimmy Carter's giveaway of the canal that he was he's not part of building, but Woodrow Wilson was.
Dr. Cooper?
I think he'd have loved them both. First of all, they were both from the South. He did like that ending the South's exclusion from the presidency. Johnson, in many ways, is exactly the same kind of legislative leader that Wilson was, getting lots of big, important legislation through. And Carter, of course, is the other most religious president we've had in the 20th century.
I can see Carter and Wilson in a room together, but the idea of Woodrow Wilson and Lyndon Johnson sitting at the same table, that just doesn't sound possible.
But Nell, they did that a lot. You know, he dealt with those Democrats,
yes,
those Capitol Hill bosses and everything. He could get along with them fine when he had to.
We're going to listen to what he sounded like in a moment, but go back to the election of 1912. There's one note I read in the book that says Woodrow Wilson was the first and only president that ever beat 2 presidents.
That's right. That's the only election where we've had 3 presidents running. A current president, a former president, and a future president. It was really a race between Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow. Yeah, it was really a race between Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. Roosevelt had bolted the Republican Party, formed his own new party. Taft stayed in to be the spoiler. I think it was the finest presidential debate we've ever had. It was almost on a level of political philosophy because both Roosevelt and Wilson discussed grand aims and grand purposes. Roosevelt had a program and philosophy he called the New Nationalism, and Wilson countered that with a program and philosophy he called the New Freedom.
Before this program's over, we're going to go back and listen to the Ovation Singers of Stanton and Ray Hoster, their conductor, to sing some of those songs from that period. We're also going to meet George Norris, an interpreter here at the home, tell us more about the house, also take us over to the museum. And we go next to Nashville, Tennessee. Go ahead, please.
Hello. I thought it was a very strange choice to say that Mrs. Wilson, who was rather active towards the end when the president was incapacitated, should be compared perhaps with Hillary Clinton. I mean, I can think of a lot of good first ladies, and Eleanor Roosevelt comes to mind quickly of somebody who did a lot, and her husband was also somewhat handicapped. But there's so many good ones. Why would you pick, of all people, Hillary Clinton?
Nell Painter?
Well, I said that there's not a good comparison. I mean, I also don't think it's a good comparison, partly because the time is so different. But the way that the three first ladies have been public women, Eleanor Roosevelt much more out in front, Mrs. Wilson much more hiding her role, and Hillary Clinton in front and back, beside. So they're all very different. And so I don't see Hillary Clinton as a way to understand Mrs. Wilson.
Port Angeles, Washington. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Morning, Brian. I'm very excited. I've been trying to reach you, but I'm a Virginian, born across the street from right where you're sitting.
Go ahead.
I have a crazy question. What's your take on the reaction there in Stanton of being so proud of Woodrow Wilson when he was really a Yankee from the North who came in? Any comments on that from anybody? Thank you.
Dr. Cooper?
They seem to love him here. I know it's an accident. He's an accidental Virginian. There's no question about that. But they love him here.
Woodrow Wilson, the 8th person to have been born in this state to go on to become president. But go back again over he was here for a year and a half, went to
Georgia.
Augusta, Georgia. For how long?
10 years, roughly.
How long was he in Columbia, South Carolina?
Another 10, although he goes away to college at the end of that. And then he came back from college and from law school when his parents were in Wilmington, North Carolina.
And he went to Davidson for how long?
A year to Davidson. He had a year out, then he went to Princeton. He was Princeton class of 1879.
Where did he get his law degree?
He never got a law degree. He studied at UVA for about a year and a half, dropped out. I don't think it was for reasons of health. They used to say that. He didn't like it very much there, and it was very common in those days for people not even to go to law school to become lawyers. So that was not getting a degree was no big deal.
Where did he get his PhD?
Johns Hopkins, which was the premier graduate school at that time. It was the place to go, and really breezed through there very quickly.
Let's go to Minneapolis next. Go ahead, please. You're on with Dr. Cooper and Dr. Painter.
Good morning. I was calling to see if you guys had talked about his anti-union activities and the brutal force he used to put down union people back in those days. Now he used that to take away people's constitutional rights to get us into World War I.
Was he anti-union, Dr. Painter?
Well, as a person of his class, he wouldn't have been a big friend of unions, but the Adamson Act, which is the 8-hour railroad bill, was something he wrapped himself in for the campaign of 1916. So when we think of Woodrow Wilson in symbolic terms, we think of him as a friend of labor.
Louisville, Kentucky. Go ahead, please. Hello, Louisville. You're on the air. Are you there, Louisville? One more time. I don't hear anybody. So we'll go on to our next call. Where's our next call from? Next call here. Let's listen to some audio tape of President Woodrow Wilson and see what he sounded like. This is only about 30 seconds long, and get our guest reaction. Go ahead.
We stand in the presence of an awakened nation, impatient of partisan make-believe. The nation has awakened to a sense of neglected ideals and neglected duties, to a consciousness that the rank and file of her people find life very hard to sustain, that her young men find opportunity embarrassed, and that her older men find business difficult to renew and maintain because of circumstances of privilege and private advantage which have interlaced their subtle threads throughout almost every part of the framework of our present law.
Dr. Cooper, that doesn't sound like a rousing speech, and that was a campaign speech.
Was that a campaign speech? I thought that was his first inaugural. It sounded very much like that. What he's doing is he's appealing to the less privileged. I mean, yeah. I think Nell's point about actually he was a friend of unions, as much as any major politician of that time was. And what he's doing is he's Franklin Roosevelt's predecessor. He builds the Democratic coalition. He builds the Democratic Party as the labor, ethnic minorities, not African Americans. I mean, that's the great difference in the 1930s.
He wasn't a big friend of the Irish Americans either.
Well, who was his secretary? Joe Tumulty was an Irish American, yeah.
Pasadena, California, you're next.
I wonder if you would talk about his academic career. I know that he taught at Bryn Mawr College and at Princeton. Exactly what did he teach?
Politics.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, to this day, I think Nell will testify to this, the name of the department at Princeton is not political science, it's politics. Because Wilson insisted this was not a science, that he believed it was a broader kind of study of politics. He was not all that sympathetic to the social sciences.
How much writing did he do in his life?
A lot. Yep. His first book, which actually wasn't his dissertation, was called Congressional Government. And then he did a study, kind of textbook study called something about politics. And then he wrote a series of books and essays, and then he did a multi-volume history of the American people, although he admitted that was a potboiler. He did that for the money.
Let's go to Boise, Idaho, capital of that state. Go ahead, please.
Yes, a couple minutes ago, a caller asked why Marshall didn't that get serious contention at the nominating convention in 1920. What is that?
Oh, yeah.
Thomas Riley Marshall.
Thomas Riley Marshall, who is most famous for saying, literally, what this country needs is a good 5-cent cigar. Marshall, they didn't nominate vice presidents and the people to be vice president in those days, thinking of them as potential presidents. He was nominated to balance the ticket. In those days, if the nominee was from the Northeast, for president, the vice presidential nominee would be from the Middle West, and he was from Indiana.
Here in Stanton, Virginia, you see a lot of churches, and as you're surrounding, you're laughing. Is that true? I mean,
Yep, it sure is. Yep.
Have you spent much time here?
I'm fairly active with the Wilson birthplace here. Yeah, I've been here a number of times. In fact, just down the street, about 2 blocks down the street, is the church that Wilson's father had. It's not the same building because this one was built in the late 19th century, and then I think you only go down about 5 blocks where you get to the Second Presbyterian Church, and I once asked somebody, I think there are about 17 or 18 Presbyterian churches in and right around Stanton. So Presbyterians are very big here.
And there are lots of different ways to be a Presbyterian.
Explain that.
Well, there are Presbyterians who are upstanding, what we now think of as Presbyterians, sort of upper middle class Presbyterians. And at least in the 19th century, there were Holy Roller Presbyterians, and there were Fundamentalist Presbyterians, and there were starchy Presbyterians, and there were Presbyterians who were more like Congregationalists, and there were Presbyterians who were more like Episcopalians, and there were Presbyterians who were more like Baptists. So there are lots and lots of different ways to be Presbyterian.
Mountain View, Arkansas. Go ahead, please.
Yes, sir. My name is Virgil Thomas. I'm in Mountain View, Arkansas. Earlier in your program, you were talking about General John J. Blackjack Pershing and his expedition down after Pancho Villa. I believe I have his car that he used during that.
Well.
I have car number 3066. I have it completely restored. I've taken it to the key to his birthplace. A man came in, and it was a car that had a green top on it. Nobody could tell me why it was different than all other Dodge Brothers in that era. And it was a military car is the reason. And a man got on the internet some way and sent word back where I was having the upholstery put in it that it was General Pershing's staff car.
How did you get it, caller?
Beg your pardon?
How did you get this car?
Well, I do old cars just for myself. And it had been disassembled in 1926 in eastern Arkansas, but the man is dead, his son is dead, and his grandson is who I got it from. And there's not much history, but I do have the car number, 3066, that's in the steel of the firewall, on the transmission, and on the motor. And on the boards, it's branded. The floorboards were still in it, and they were really boards.
Well,
so
thank
I know
you very much.
Is the car number, but I'm not positive that it's his. It seems to be.
Okay, thanks for sharing that with us. Let's go back to our opening when we had the Pierce Arrow automobile, the White House limousine from 1919. How big a deal is that to have it here at the museum?
Very, very.
Why?
It's one of the few presidential cars, or I don't know whether it's the earliest one or not. It very well may be, and it's a wonderful old car. In fact, before you had your ride there, I got to take it out for a test drive, and it's a lovely car.
Let's go to Iowa City, Iowa, talking about 28th President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson.
Good morning, Brian and professors. I guess this is sort of a critical comment, but just wanted to know what your feelings were about the genuineness of Wilson's neutrality. To my way of reading it, I think he's too much of an Anglophile for that to ever have been real to begin with. And maybe you could attribute some of it to his Presbyterianism and his belief in the elect and all that at the beginning of the program. And also, I think the thing I'd be most critical of him for was the Red Scare of 1919 to 1921, the deportation of all sorts of labor activists and, lefties of various stripes. Your comment. Thanks.
Thanks. Go back to 1912 when he was elected. He took office in 1913 in March. What was the world situation then?
The Europeans had been in an arms race for years, and so anybody looking at it, sort of concentrating on it, would have said, oh dear, something might happen. But this had been true since the turn of the century there. So we're talking about a situation in which there's lots of scares, there's lots of saber rattling, there's lots of imperialism going on. But when Woodrow Wilson took office, he had some ideas about what he wanted to do, and they were all about what we now call domestic policy. It was about trust busting. It was about taxes. There were three things.
Antitrust, taxes, tariff. Lower the tariff.
Yeah.
Tariff, yeah.
And so those were the issues that he got involved with, and he got it all wrapped up by about 1914 and said, okay, this is fine. Everything's going to go along.
Who controlled the Congress in 1914?
Not Woodrow Wilson.
Democrats?
Democrats, Democratic majorities. I think I disagree with Nell there. I think he had very good control over Congress indeed. The other one, I'm sorry, we blanked on that one, the Federal Reserve. That's the other big thing, banking reform.
Banking.
He said, right after he got elected president in 1912, he said to a friend of his in Princeton, it would be an irony of fate if my administration had to deal chiefly with foreign affairs because all my preparation has been in domestic politics.
Yeah. Was he truly neutral?
I think he was.
I think he was, too. I think he was truly neutral from an intellectual point of view, sort of as an intelligence. But also, there were so many reasons that taking the United States into a war in 1914 or 1915 or 1916, this very heterogeneous population, it would have been a political suicide.
Let's go to Smithfield, North Carolina. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Brian. Really enjoying the series, and special good morning to Dr. Painter and
thank
Dr.
you.
Cooper also. I had two comments. One was that in talking about whether President Wilson was anti-Semitic, the fact that he appointed Louis Brandeis to the Supreme Court, who was the first Jew appointed to the Supreme Court, would indicate perhaps he was not. And the other comment was, and then I have a question, Mrs. Wilson happened to die on his birthday, December the 28th, 1961, and the question was, his Attorney General at the beginning of his term was James C. McReynolds, and he was noted for being anti-Semitic and also a very racist person. And I just wondered, of course, he appointed him to the Supreme Court the following year, I believe in 1914, but I was just wondering if perhaps he was encouraged in his resegregating the rest homes and the drinking facilities in the various federal departments, and I'll hang up and listen to your comment. And thanks again for a really fine program.
Thanks. It was Mr. McReynolds who went on to be a justice, and you hear it, you see it in every book that he was an anti-Semite and a curmudgeon and all those things, and that people didn't even go to his funeral from the court.
Much loved.
Do you get credit for a Brandeis, but you get a pass with a McReynolds?
Well, this is difficult because several things are going on. One is that a person can be an anti-Semite and still have savvy on politics. And so Meg Brandeis, who was an excellent and well-known lawyer, so making him a Supreme Court justice, to my mind, says nothing about anti-Semitism. It's about politics.
We'll go back to Louis.
I'd like to say something about the Brandeis relationship, because I think this is one of the most important relationships in Wilson's life. These two men were almost exactly the same age. Brandeis is from Louisville, Kentucky. He's from a very similar background, even though he's Jewish. The two of them met right after Wilson got the nomination. It's Brandeis really becomes his closest domestic advisor, really helps Wilson formulate the new freedom for the campaign. Then, at the beginning of his presidency, Wilson wanted to appoint Brandeis Attorney General. Conservative Democrats talked him out of it. Then, the first vacancy on the Supreme Court. Again, Wilson wants to appoint Brandeis. Conservative Democrats talk him out of that and into appointing McReynolds, who he said was the worst mistake he ever made in an appointment. And finally, in 1960, he says, I've had it with you guys. I'm going to appoint the person I want. I'm going to appoint Brandeis.
And then Brandeis University was created after his death. And then Felix Frankfurter took Brandeis's place in the, what, 31, 32? 39 on the court.
39, yes. Brandeis has a long career, a distinguished career on the Supreme Court.
1916 to 1939?
That's correct.
Boulder, Colorado. Next, go ahead, please.
Thanks a lot. It's been a couple years since I last called into C-SPAN, but I watch you all the time, even though I don't call in. But with this series, Brian, I decided I'm going to call in on Wilson because my knowledge about Wilson is not very good. I want to ask this question about the whole racism issue. I know we pass this over, we just say this word. But I would like the professor, I think Dr. Payne, to talk about the details of Wilson's racism, how it played out in terms of his relationship with African Americans. For example, my understanding was there was an early movie that came out, I think it's called Birth of a Nation, I'm not sure, which he praised and said was accurate history.
Yeah.
Could you talk about those details? And finally, let me just say this last thing. I'm suspicious of some of you professors who spend your whole time studying one particular president, because I noticed that you guys tend to heap praise on the presidents that you study. I saw this particularly, Brian, with Hayes. I think you kind of win over the stealing of that election in 1876 and the fact that blacks were really cheated out of their votes in that one. And Lincoln was a great president, regardless of all the revisionism. Thanks.
Nell Painter.
Okay. The callers raised a lot of very interesting questions. The first thing is racism is a social thing. It's a cultural thing. And I don't think it makes sense to talk about a particular person as a racist, but as someone who may engage in racist acts. And Wilson was a person of his time, of his class, of his race, and his views were subject to modulation. But he bristled when he had to deal with black men who were educated and his equals. So, for instance, he had a visit by people like William Monroe Trotter from Boston, people who said, look, we want to have a better, we want you to treat black Americans in a better way than you have been and also in the past, and we don't like the segregation of the federal workforce. And he just couldn't hear them because it was personally extremely difficult. When it came down to the question of the League of Nations, several groups lobbied him. Irish Americans lobbied him, and they thought they were troublesome. People like W.B. Du Bois lobbied him to make democracy real in the United States, and he didn't like that sort of thing. So on the one hand, Woodrow Wilson was a person who was acting out of really conservative views of his time.
What about the knock on professors?
But wait a minute, before we get to, can we just say something about Birth of a Nation?
D.W. Griffiths, what year?
1915. It was the sort of inspiration for the new Klan, actually, in 1915 as well. The novel on which The Birth of a Nation was based, a novel called The Klansman by a North Carolina writer named Dixon. Dixon had been in graduate school with Woodrow Wilson. And so, in a sense, he was doing a favor. But everything I know about Woodrow Wilson says that the view of Reconstruction that you get in the novel The Klansman, in the plays, and in the movie, that was fine with Woodrow Wilson. So I don't think that he was just doing a favor or bending his nature to praise this as history written with lightning.
Knock on professors?
Well,
you get too close?
I study two of them, so I guess I've got to, like, somebody once said about Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, I said, I'm like the Texan who said there are two kinds of music, country and Western, and I like them both. There are plenty of people who are very critical, who study presidents, who are quite critical of them. I'm sorry, I don't buy it.
We're at the Woodrow Wilson Birthplace Home and Museum, which is open to the public here in Stanton, Virginia. They get about 31,000 visitors a year. 5,000 of those are students. We go next to Alexandria, Virginia. Good morning.
Hello. Actually, I'm from right outside Old Town, Alexandria. I live in Fairfax, which you would appreciate that we have a Alexandria zone. My daughter's name, I'll make the question first, and then I'll make the comment after, just the verses. The question is, my granddaughter's name is Stanton Woods. She lives in Irving, Texas. And she actually is named after the city of Stanton, Virginia. And I will tell you why, but the question I have is for your docents or curator there. About 4 years ago, we visited there. My granddaughter signed in, and I showed this elderly docent that her name was Stanton. And she was all tithered. She got these other elderly docents around and says, my gosh, here's a lady named after our wonderful city here. But the reason why she's named after, my mother was born on Beverly Street there in Stanton, and she met my dad, who was going to Stanton Military Academy. He was a classmate of Barry Goldwater. I will tell you this about Barry Goldwater. My son wrote a letter to him asking him if he could have any remembrance of my father. And he wrote back a very, very gracious letter with a tremendous amount of misspelling and typing errors in it. But it was so gracious, you know, and he said because he was elderly at the time and so whatever, he can't remember, but he had a certain fact that would only be my dad. He said he was a contractor's son, and that would be a bit of trivia that only a classmate would have known because my son didn't mention it. But my question is there any other Stantons, who's ever visited there? Names Stauton, not like these Stanton, or as they say here in Washington, D.C. area, as you know, Brian, Staunton. Even though we're only 2.5 hours away, they still say Staunton, you know, and I hear it every day on the radio. It's Stanton, 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 in weather reports.
Okay, thanks for the call. I appreciate it. Well, I'll try to ask George Norris about that in a few minutes. Either one of you know anything about the origin of the name Stanton?
Nope.
And why it's Stanton and why it's not Staunton? Let's go to Warrenton, Virginia next. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning. How are you, sir?
Fine, welcome.
I'm really interested in listening to these two professors. They appear to be incredibly educated people. I can't wait to read both of their books. I've always been a Wilson optimist, so when the wonderful lady was talking about him and referring to racism, it sort of popped my bubble a little bit about Woodrow Wilson. But then she came back and said, well, he was a man of his time, that time's culture and so forth. And she's exactly right. You know, prejudice is wrong wherever you are, and we still have it in some degree today. But if we look at backbone and moral character, my thing that I would like to say is I wish the people today in the administration that we have would have half the moral character and backbone he had. The prejudice notwithstanding, I believe if he had lived today, perhaps he could have gotten around that. But both of these people have really done a great study, and I can't wait to read both books. And I really appreciate you playing his voice. I've never heard his voice before, and when I listened to it, it just absolutely confirmed how intelligent he was. You can hear the intelligence just dripping out of his voice. It was wonderful to hear it. But I just wish he would be a man that we could have today as president, because I believe we would all be better off.
Thanks for the call, and let's show some video of his train tour back in 1919 when he went across the country, Dr. Cooper, to do what?
He was trying to sell the League of Nations. He was in a conflict with the Senate. There was a lot of opposition in the Senate to going into the League of Nations, and what he's trying to do is whip up public opinion to build a fire behind the senators. So
what was the League of Nations supposed to be?
League of Nations was supposed to be an organization to maintain international order and prevent wars. And the senators, the major question was, would this compromise American sovereignty and independence? And he's trying to say it wouldn't.
Nell Painter, do you want to add to that?
Well, I think this gets back to the whole question of whether or not the United States would have a free hand in the Western Hemisphere, on the one hand, and whether or not the United States would be called upon to commit troops overseas.
Yep.
Which is a question that we still haven't solved. Are we going to go to Kosovo? Are we going to go to East Timor? Yep. Are we going to go to Turkey or Serbia to enforce the peace? We still don't know whether or not that's a good idea.
The question was, Wilson, did he want us to be the policeman of the world? Yes, he wanted us to be one of several police persons of the world, really.
Dr. Cooper, how many people were in the United States in 1912?
About 120, 130 million, is that right now?
I was thinking 90, but I might be in
I think it had gone over 100 at some point in the early 1900s.
Yeah.
And the total number of people that voted back in 1912 was, what, only about 13, 14 million?
Something like that, yeah.
Well, remember that women couldn't vote
That's
then,
right.
so we lost a whole lot of the electorate.
And African Americans were effectively disfranchised except in very rare cases.
Right. So we have a lot of people who didn't vote.
Yeah.
Dr. Painter and Dr. Cooper are going to remain on the set, and we are now up on the Coulter Street entrance to this house. George Norris does what here?
Mr. Lamb, let me first welcome you to the Woodrow Wilson birthplace, the birthplace of our 28th president, Thomas Woodrow Wilson. I do interpretation of history on the site, between the birthplace itself and the museum. Why don't we step inside where it's less noisy?
You know, while we're getting set up here, why don't we take a call that's waiting from Westchester County, New York, so that that person doesn't have to keep spending this money. Go ahead, Westchester County.
Thank you. I don't mean to beat the issue to death, but my inquiry shares some of the sentiments of a previous caller. It has to do with President Wilson's attitude towards black people, actually. And I wanted to ask the professors, was the Panama Canal under construction throughout the duration of President Wilson's term?
It's completed right at the beginning of the First World War. That's when the canal is actually opened. So it is opened under Wilson, but it was begun under Theodore Roosevelt.
Okay, thanks. We'll take some more calls in just a moment. George Norris?
Mr. Lamb, we are in the Presbyterian Manse here in Stanton, Virginia, that was built in 1846 at the cost of $4,000, which was quite a substantial sum at that time. The Wilson family arrives in Stanton in 1855. Reverend Wilson was a professor down at Hampton-Sydney College, where he taught natural science and chemistry. He arrives in Stanton with his wife Jessie, or Janet, she's known as both names, and we have two small daughters at this time, Annie and Marion. Our 28th president, Thomas Woodrow Wilson, is born in this manse, minister's home, December 28th, 1856. However, the Wilsons are only here for a short time.
Show us some things in this room right here.
The most important thing in the parlor is actually the social heart of the home. The most important piece in this room is the Wilson family Bible there on the table, and we've opened it to the page where Reverend Wilson has recorded his son's birth, December 28, 1856 at 12:75 at
How
night.
many brothers and sisters did he have?
He has two sisters when he arrives in Stanton, Annie and Marion, and when they leave Stanton and move to Augusta, Georgia, a second son is born, Joseph Ruggles Wilson, Jr.
Again, how long did he live in this house?
The family is here about 2.5 years. The president is here nearly a year as an infant before they moved to Augusta, Georgia in 1857.
What's that guitar over there?
That's one of our prized pieces. The guitar on the chair that we see in the corner actually belonged to the president's mother, Jessie. Very talented lady. She played piano, apparently by all written accounts had a very beautiful voice, and that seems to run in the family because the president had a very nice tenor voice, and his eldest daughter, Margaret, made records for the Red Cross during the First World War, which we have displayed in the museum.
How about the sewing machine?
The sewing machine is actually a status symbol. It's a 1852 Willer Wilson sewing machine. The average family in 1855, 1856 makes between $500 and $600 a year. That sewing machine cost $250. They wanted you to see that piece when you came into the parlor.
George Norris, let me interrupt to take a call. We have waiting from Millwood, Virginia. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Good morning to both of you. And, Brian, I'd like to take the opportunity to just simply second every compliment you've ever received. I just don't think it's possible to say enough good about C-SPAN. I'd like to refer to two issues that were current during President Roosevelt's time. And the first is about the Federal Reserve. This is a brief paragraph from a report. After previous attempts to push the Federal Reserve Act through Congress, a group of bankers funded and staffed Woodrow Wilson's campaign for president. He had committed to sign this act in 1913. A Senator Nelson Aldrich, maternal grandfather of the Rockefellers, pushed the Federal Reserve Act through Congress just before Christmas, when much of Congress was on vacation. When elected, Wilson passed the Fed. Later, Wilson remorsefully replied, referring to the Fed, quote, "I have unwittingly ruined my country." The reference for this is Repeal the Federal Reserve by a Reverend Casimir Frank Giroux. And I think where the previous caller spoke to Wilson's moral stand, possibly he came to this, and it's one of the reasons he made this quote. If I'd like to make a brief comment about the income tax that was referred to by the two people, but I'd like to give the reference for this report. It's www.cal-neva.com/FRB/.
Let me interrupt, though, because Dr. Cooper could probably answer quickly the Federal Reserve question that you've got or the point you're making. Dr. Cooper?
The book you've been reading has got some things mixed up there. Senator Aldrich, you're exactly right, that was Nelson Rockefeller's grandfather, had pushed through a bill in the late days of the Taft administration, which was backed by Wall Street. That bill is scrapped and superseded by the Federal Reserve Act. And in fact, that's really, in many ways, I think, the proof of Wilson's legislative mastery is that this very complicated, very controversial act, that he's able to get it through with a lot of hard work.
Is our Millwood caller still there?
Yes, I am.
Go ahead with your next point on taxes.
The two spoke to the enthusiasm of the income tax, and I think that it's possible that that enthusiasm had to do with the misunderstanding or perhaps spin. Number one, my understanding was that they stated that the percentage that it started out would always remain, and of course we've seen that's not been true. And also, it was to be for corporations and not necessarily the individual. It also, from my understanding, was essentially a method to counteract the inflation that was going to be an inevitable outcome of taking us off the gold standard and using the fiat money, which is the worthless paper Federal Reserve notes we have today.
Okay, I'll let you go there and ask Nell Painter if she wants to comment.
Yeah. You know, I think that the income tax has a pretty bad reputation these days, but it was a fairer way of raising money than tariffs, because tariffs were on items that people used every day, clothing, wool, even whiskey and tobacco. I mean, these were things that people used all the time, no matter how much money you made. But what you paid for income tax was calculated on how much you made. It was a progressive income tax. So the very rich had a higher percentage than the people who were middle class. In those days, the income tax did not apply to almost everybody as it does today.
Let's come back up here to George North, because we're not going to get through this house. What do you do for a living full-time?
I work here during the summers usually, and then I do homebound instruction for Stanton City Schools during the remainder of the year.
And when people come through the house, what's the one question that they always ask?
How long the president was here. And most people think that President Wilson is from New Jersey. Actually, they do not realize that he was born here in Stanton, Virginia in 1856. We get that quite a bit. And the different styles of the Presbyterian Church here in Stanton. This was a very wealthy congregation and a very active congregation. The formal dining area that we are in right now is primarily used for company dinners or maybe a visiting minister that was passing through Stanton. They would serve a meal at this table, and generally they would serve a 7-course meal. We're set for the last course, which would be dessert. The Wilson pieces in the room that are very substantial, the silver-plated tea service that we see on the sideboard there is actually a Christmas present to Reverend Wilson and his wife Jessie from the Augusta, Georgia congregation. We have to remember that's where the Wilson family leaves and moves to in 1857. In the corner cupboard here, we have flatware that belonged to Mrs. Wilson, and that's very substantial. It's engraved with her initials.
Which Wilson?
Jessie, the mother.
The mother.
Yes, sir. And on the far wall, the steel engraving we see of George Washington. Well, we have to remember that Wilson and Washington are 2 of the 8 Virginia presidents that we have, and that Virginia is actually the mother state of presidents. And President Wilson wrote a popular biography on George Washington in 1896.
By the way, I don't know if you heard the call. We had a woman call and ask whether or not you've had anybody else come through here who is named Stanton.
No, sir. I've never encountered anyone with the name Stanton with the U. Now, I hear we usually know if you're a native or not if you pronounce it Staunton, and the U is silent. We are in the entrance hall of the home. The piece before me, the tall case clock, is actually the oldest piece in the home. The mechanisms of the clock are made in Birmingham, England, 1787. The frame of the clock, which is cherry wood, is actually made right here in Stanton City, early 19th century. The historical significance of the clock, besides the fact that it still works, but only strikes on the hour, it belonged to the Waddell family. Dr. Waddell delivered Thomas Woodrow Wilson December 28, 1856.
What's this chair right over here?
This chair is actually another Wilson piece. It's Gothic Revival style. Since we are in the hallway, the entrance hall, on the cold December day, if someone is waiting, a member of the congregation, to visit Reverend Wilson or his wife Jessie, well, they lift the seat up, as you can see, and you could put scarves or gloves underneath. Ingenious.
While we go into this next one, let's go to Gaithersburg, Maryland for a call that's waiting. Go ahead, Gaithersburg. You're on the air.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you for C-SPAN. As a student in college some years ago, I became aware of the speeches, the writings of Woodrow Wilson, and I've since collected many of his speeches and papers and those kinds of things. I think he was perhaps the greatest writer of our presidents, and I've wondered through the years what kind of speaker he was and what he sounded like. I wonder where can I get perhaps some more actual recordings of his speeches, and I wonder if you would play some more of some political speeches if you have some.
Sure, we have another clip we can use here very soon. Do you have anything you sell here that...
We do not have any of President Wilson's recorded speeches in our bookstore. However, in the museum, in the Princeton Gallery, where we will go later on, we have an actual Old 78 on the Victor label of a speech that he gave to farmers August 1912. They're very, very scarce to find the recordings of President Wilson.
Why don't we just take a moment, and I think this next cut is about 30-some seconds long, and we can listen again for those who've never heard the voice of Woodrow Wilson. Have you, by the way, yourself listened to much of him?
No, sir, I've never heard the voice, so
you
this
have
would be
never
a
heard
treat
the voice.
for me. No.
How long have you been here at this house?
A little over a year.
Okay, let's listen in and see what Woodrow Wilson sounded like.
It is in the broad light of this new day that we stand face to face with great questions of right and of justice, questions of national development, of the development of character and of standards of action, no less than of a better business system, more free, more equitable, more open to ordinary men, practicable to live under, tolerable to work under, or a better fiscal system whose taxes shall not come out of the pockets of the many to go into the pockets of the few, and within whose intricacies special privilege may not so easily find cover.
Are you surprised at all, George Norris?
What a treat. How eloquent and so precise. No, I'm not surprised at all. From everything I've written, he's one of the greatest orators of the 20th century.
What do you have in here you want to show?
This is Reverend Wilson's private study. Although the family is only here for 2.5 years, the etching that we see over here to the side is actually the only interior drawing of the church that Reverend Wilson used. Unfortunately, the church was torn down in 1962. The other, the color lithograph above the mantelpiece is very important because that's Nassau Hall, which is located on the grounds of Princeton University, or at the College of New Jersey when the president attended as a student. Reverend Wilson received his Bachelor of Divinity degree from Princeton Theological Seminary, 1846-1847.
Dr. Cooper, you went to Princeton. Nell Painter, you teach at Princeton. If you're there on the Princeton campus, how aware are you that school?
Well, the first thing is that there's the Woodrow Wilson School, which is a great big white building on the corner of Prospect and Washington Road. So it's sometimes called Woody Woo at Woodrow Wilson. And then if you are with faculty or you're going to the faculty club, which is Prospect House, this is where Woodrow Wilson lived when he was president. And there are lots and lots of paintings of Woodrow Wilson and Woodrow Wilson's family, people like Colonel Howes and so forth.
When I was an undergrad at Princeton, I used to beef about, you'd think only two people had ever gone there, Woodrow Wilson and F. Scott Fitzgerald. I think the reason for that is that those are the two great Princetonians whose fame and whose careers were really wrapped up with Princeton.
George Norris, back to the final room here.
Mr. Lamb, this is the most important room in the manse. In this room on December 28, 1856, our 28th president, Thomas Woodrow Wilson, was born in this room. The two most important pieces behind me, this is Mrs. Wilson's nursing rocker. You notice that it is low to the floor. The crib, however, is the crib that President Wilson used as an infant. That crib was made in Virginia.
Where'd you get it? Where'd you find it?
Well, it was donated, the rocking chair and the crib, as were many of the items we have in the home, as well as the 1919 Pierce Arrow limousine, by President Wilson's second wife, Edith. But I wanted to point out one other thing, too. The bed that we see here is also a Wilson piece, Egyptian Revival style. This is not the birth bed, but this bed did leave with the family in 1857 when they moved to Augusta, Georgia. And finally, the pieces that we see here displayed on the table are here today only. They're on loan from the First Presbyterian Congregation of Stanton. The baptismal font that we see here is the one that was used in April of 1857 at the christening of the president. We have a communion cup, plate, and urn, all used at the time that Reverend Wilson was minister here in Stanton from 1855 to 1857.
George Ernst, we'll see you in a few moments when we get back over in the museum. We have a call waiting from Hopkinsville, Kentucky. Go ahead, Hopkinsville. You're on the air.
Hello.
Hi.
Yes, sir. I would like for your two guests, if they would please, to comment on Mr. Wilson's relationship with his chief of the Secret Service, Colonel Edmund Will Starling. He wrote a book in 1946 entitled Starling of the White House, where he speaks very highly of President Wilson and his wife. And apparently Uncle Will had a very close working relationship with the president. And also I'd like to know if perhaps there's a copy of Starling of the White House in the Wilson home. I will
Cooper, do you know?
sit back.
I know very little about that. Evidently, the Wilsons were quite popular and well-liked by all the White House staff. They were nice people. Wilson was actually rather down-to-earth, easygoing kind of guy in that way. And Starling, I think his great problem, of course, with Wilson, it was not with Wilson, but it was the fact that the World War was going on, and security became much more of an issue and a concern for the White House.
We're up on the second floor, or it depends on how you look at this. We might be on the first floor, I guess. The street is right out behind me here, Coulter Street in Stanton, Virginia, which we've said earlier is about 3 hours south of Washington, D.C. on I-81. And I can now go out, look over the balcony, and that earlier when you were watching, and as a matter of fact, our guests are right down below us here looking out, but right down, also parallel to where our guests are, is Ray Hoster, who is the man in charge of the Ovation Singers. Mr. Hoster, what's this all about?
Well, this is Woodrow Wilson time, and we do Woodrow Wilson material, so here we are.
How many years did you spend in the Air Force?
30 years and 30 days.
How long have you been here?
16 years.
And who's in your group there?
Well, we've got doctors, lawyers, no Indians. We've got doctors, lawyers, accountants. We've got the director of the DeJarnette Center here for children. We've got the publisher, the local newspaper. Just our general collection of retirees and eager volunteers.
How long have you been together?
About 14 years.
Why do you do this?
Someone has to. No, we do it because we enjoy it, obviously. We try to service whatever may come to need here in the community. We try to service it.
How often do you do Wilson songs?
Well, originally we did it just for the birthplace, but now it serves as Stanton history, Shenandoah Valley history, Virginia history, and general patriotic material. So we use them not only as educational material, but actually as entertainment material, too.
How many songs do you know?
We've got about a dozen Woodrow Wilson things that they're hard to come by, and inch by inch we're collecting.
And what are you going to sing for us today?
This is called, I Think We've Got Another Washington, and Wilson is his name. Shall we?
It's all yours.
When Yankee Doodle came to town, he brought a man of great renown and called him Georgie Washington. In history I'm told, he proved a hero bold by winning victories untold. Conditions are about the same today. be proud to say, I think we've got another Washington, someone who's just as good as he can be. He's called the man of peace, no matter where he goes, no matter where he's for me. It takes a little time for him to make up his mind, but he gets there just the same. I think we've got another Washington, and Wilson is his name. I said I think we've got another Washington, and Wilson is his name.
Wilson, that's all. Wilson.
Our American President's Life Portrait Series continues the last 2 weeks of 1999 with a look at each one of the 41 men who've been President of the United States. Up next, a visit to Stanton, Virginia, and the birthplace home of the nation's 28th President, Woodrow Wilson. Earlier this year, we met with Wilson historians John Milton Cooper and Nell Irvin Painter about the former president's life and times. The program lasts about 3 hours and begins with a brief video biography chronicling his life.
For beauty, I am not a star. There are others more handsome by far, but my face I don't mind it, for I am behind it. It's the people in front that I jar.
Thomas Woodrow Wilson was born December 28, 1856 in Stanton, Virginia, but raised both in Augusta, Georgia and Columbia, South Carolina.
My first recollection is of standing at my father's gateway in Augusta, Georgia, when I was 4 years old, and hearing someone pass and say that Mr. Lincoln was elected, and there was to be a war.
When Wilson left the South as a young man, he dropped the Thomas from his name. From a young age, he expressed an interest in politics, but didn't hold public office until 1911, when at the age of 55, he became the governor of New Jersey. In the early part of the century, Wilson was thought of as reform-minded and progressive. He spent the majority of his professional life first as
Rebecca Stanton, wife of the Virginia Governor William Gooch. The city has been home to a number of vital industries, including sawmills and factories that made wagons, boots, shoes, and woolen clothing. And fans of country music probably know the Statler brothers. They're all Stanton natives. The little museum here for the Statler brothers. Stanton is also the birthplace, as you know by now, of the 28th President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, Thomas Woodrow Wilson. You can see it there on your map, Charlottesville, about 40 minutes from here, and that on your screen is the house, the manse. We are seated down below there on a beautiful sunny day here in September. Our two guests on the set, Nell Irvin Painter, who is a professor at Princeton University, and John Milton Cooper, who is a professor at the University of Wisconsin, both experts on Woodrow Wilson. I want to ask, before we're going to take a call here in just a moment, how many children did he have?
3, all daughters. Margaret, Jessie, and Nell. Margaret never married. As earlier the curator was mentioning that music ran in the Wilson family, and Margaret, as he said, sang for the Red Cross in World War I, later tried to be an opera singer.
Is she buried in India? Which one's buried in India?
Yes, she's buried in India, that's correct. Then she later got in with a guru in India and is buried there. Jessie married Francis Sayre, who was an international lawyer, professor at Harvard, later Governor General of the Philippines under Franklin Roosevelt. And she died in the early 1930s. And then Nell married William Gibbs McAdoo, who was in Wilson's cabinet. They were divorced in the 1930s, and she died in the 1960s sometime.
And Nell Painter, this is, we'll talk about this more later, but at what time did Woodrow Wilson decide that we should go into World War I?
Probably very early 1917, huh?
Not too long before he went to Congress and asked for the Declaration of War.
But it was his second term.
It was his second term. He knew that he could not keep us out of war. He knew that he couldn't stand up to the Democrats' campaign promise for him. He kept us out of war. He knew that. But when it would happen, that really had to do with submarine warfare. So in a sense, it had to do with the exigencies of one particular submarine commander as well as German policy generally.
What he did was he tried, as Nell's right, he knew he couldn't alone keep us out of the war. He tried to mediate the war. Right after he got reelected, he really put on a peace offensive, which culminated in one of his great speeches, which is called Peace Without Victory, proposing a compromise peace in Europe. But by that time, the Germans had decided on their own to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. And they did it knowing full well that this would bring the United States into the war, and they believed they could knock the British out of the war before we could make any difference.
Hillsborough, Kentucky. I know you've waited for a long time. Go ahead, please.
Hillsborough, Texas.
I'm sorry. My screen said Kentucky. Go ahead.
Yes, I attended the University of Texas at Austin, and on campus there's a statue of Woodrow Wilson, and at the base of the statue the inscription says that he taught there for a couple of years, and I'm curious what you can tell me about his time spent in Texas.
I hope that statue doesn't say that because he didn't. He had friends from Texas. Colonel House, his advisor, was a great Texan, and then later his brother-in-law, Stockton Axon, taught at Rice. But no, Wilson never did teach in Texas.
Next call, Kalispell, Montana. Is that it?
Yes. I'd like to ask people there, did President Wilson know of the connection of his alter ego, so-called by him, Edward Mandell House, with the Round Table?
Colonel House is his confidential advisor, sort of agent. Colonel House thought he was manipulating Wilson, and I'm afraid Colonel House is not somebody I like too much. It's a somewhat strange relationship there.
Can you tell us more about who he was?
Yeah, House was a very wealthy man from Texas. His father actually had been an Englishman, gotten in on the cotton trade early in Texas. And then House had dabbled a lot in Texas politics. He was known as kind of kingmaker, especially behind that Governor Jim Hogg in Texas. And then he decided to go national with this sort of king-making idea. And he latched onto Wilson, actually, after Wilson had gotten the nomination.
Nell Painter, what incident triggered the whole entrance into World War I?
The Sussex. The Zimmerman telegram.
I mean, did the Lusitania, was that the one that tripped it?
No, the Lusitania is earlier, and that was a crisis, and Woodrow Wilson wanted to answer in a tougher way, and Bryan resigned. And
William Jennings
Bryan, who had been Secretary of State. And after Bryan came Robert Lansing, who had been Undersecretary of State, and Lansing was much more anxious to get into the war, much more the Anglophile. So the idea for mediation is really a Bryan-esque idea. And when Bryan was Secretary of State, Woodrow Wilson was not that supportive of Bryan's ideas. Bryan was an odd bird to be Secretary of State. He was a Midwesterner, he was a populist in a position that usually Wall Street lawyers or people from the Eastern establishment held. And he had a dry, he was a dry Secretary of State. So he had these state dinners and he wouldn't serve wine, he'd serve grape juice. And he wanted to make he made a series of treaties of beating swords into plowshares. And, you know, Bryan really wanted peace. And so over submarine warfare, Bryan resigned over the issue of submarine warfare, over the issue of whether or not Americans should be allowed to travel in the ships of belligerent nations. And so Woodrow Wilson was not ready to keep Americans out of harm's way. Bryan wanted to go to all lengths to keep Americans out of harm's way, to make sure the Americans did not get in the war.
Little Rock, Arkansas, you're next. What would you like to talk
Brian,
about? Hi.
This is Mrs. Woodrow Wilson you're speaking to. I married my husband in 1944, and he was named for Woodrow Wilson. His family tells me, and he told me the same thing. My husband passed away when he was 36 years old.
Oh, dear.
Just lived 10 years after I was married to him. But I'm real interested in Woodrow Wilson history and everything, and I'm really enjoying it. And just thought I'd let you know.
Are you still Mrs. Woodrow Wilson?
I am still Mrs. Woodrow Wilson.
In your lifetime, both of you, have you seen many things named after Woodrow Wilson?
Oh, yeah, plenty of things. Actually, I once, as a child, I grew up in Washington, D.C., and as a young teenager, I actually saw Mrs. Woodrow Wilson. She was, my father belonged to the Army-Navy Club in Washington, and my mother pointed out, oh, look over there, there's Mrs. Woodrow Wilson. She was having dinner with Francis Sayer, Jr., who was Wilson's grandson by the first marriage.
We are, by the way, at the Wilson home in Stanton, Virginia, and we're on a main thoroughfare. There's lots of noise around here, and so if you're hearing noise, it's cars going by, and it sounds like at the moment somebody's torn a tree down somewhere.
That's right. It sounds like
beginning
a
the
chainsaw.
process, but
Yeah.
timed it perfectly for our music this morning. He's buried at National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., the only president to be buried in the District of Columbia. But there's a famous house that people visit on S Street in Washington. Have you ever been there, Nell?
Yes,
Painter?
indeed.
Why did, how long did he live there, I guess?
Let's see, he lived there from the time he left the presidency, so we're talking about 4 years, aren't we? Yeah.
3, actually, just under 3 years. He dies in February 1924, left the White House in March 1923. So just that's the house of afterward. It's in many ways, it's a lovely place. I always have the sense there at the S Street house that that's more her house than his, you know, because he was an invalid.
He was so incapacitated. Yeah.
And how long did she live there?
Until 1961. As Nell pointed out, she died on his birthday in 1961, December.
So she stayed there until then. He's got a cane there in his hand. Was he mobile then?
The stroke affected his left side. He never got full use of his left arm or leg back. So yeah, he needed that cane to hobble around.
New York City, you're next. Go ahead, please.
Hi there. I understand that the first Secretary of Commerce was appointed during the second Wilson administration, a fellow by the name of William Cox Redfield, who was sort of active in New York City politics. I was wondering if you could tell me anything about Mr. Redfield.
First of all, the Secretary of Commerce post was created under Theodore Roosevelt, so he's not the first Secretary of Commerce. William Redfield, actually, he served all 8 years. He was his original Secretary of Commerce. He's one of the few people who serves through the whole Wilson, 2 terms of the Wilson presidency. He was a New York Democrat who was also active in various business affairs. Apparently a pretty good Secretary of Commerce. Not too much is remembered about him.
Bisbee, Arizona. Go ahead, please.
Well, this is Bisbee, Arizona. Thank you. I'm right here. I want this directed to Mr. Cooper. This is in reference to the Bisbee deportation in July 1917, in which over 1,000 miners were deported from Bisbee to New Mexico. And Wilson, who was a very close friend to Phelps Dodge President Cleveland Dodge, this is a mining community, by the way, was, of course, a part of this whole business. I would like to know from Professor Cooper what his comments would be about this, and if he does know whether there was a very excellent book written by Professor James Burkitt called Forging the Copper Collar, which goes into this in detail. Thank you very much, C-SPAN, for these wonderful programs.
In just a second, I want to turn that question over to Nell because she knows much more about that than I do. As I understand it, that's a terrible thing that happened in Bisbee. It's awful. As I understand it, though, that was a local action. That was not carried out by the Justice Department. And I don't know, frankly, and indeed you're correct that Wilson was a very close friend of Cleveland Dodge's, but I'm not sure that that necessarily had anything to do with it.
Well, I think the most important thing to remember here is that those miners were IWW, Industrial Workers of the World, which was the far left side of the labor movement. The labor movement gaining strength during the First World War, but still rudimentary. So in a sense, this was an anti-radical action. And a lot was going on at that time against the Wobblies, the IWW, on the local level by people who were policing the work sites in question. So the Lawrence, Massachusetts strike, for instance, was another action in which the Wobblies were involved. So the labor movement is very important during the First World War, and the First World War is very important for the labor movement. But the labor movement was not simply the AFL, it was also this far left movement the Wobblies.
We go to Spearfish, South Dakota next. Hello.
Bravo, C-SPAN, another great show on the American presidents. I watch it every morning while I'm on my treadmill when it's on. I had a question for the two professors from Princeton. About 20 years ago, I was at a convention of university professors. I'm a retired professor myself, and a couple of the fellows there from Princeton were talking about how the Princeton faculty had generated the movement to get Woodrow Wilson to leave the university presidency and run for governor. And it was done partly because they wanted a new president at the university. It seemed kind of a bizarre notion, and kind of hard to figure out how a couple of profs in the 1970s could have known about this. But anyway, do you have any comments?
You want to talk to that, Nell?
Well, it's Princeton lore, and Woodrow Wilson, as president of Princeton, is very much present with us. The great controversy was about the graduate school. In a larger sense, it was about the balance between graduate education and undergraduate education. In one sense, Woodrow Wilson won because there's an excellent graduate school at Princeton University now. But in another case, he lost because it still is very much a teaching institution, and it's very much undergraduate centered. So there was a lot of controversy toward the last years of Woodrow Wilson's presidency of Princeton University. And I can understand how people would want to move on from being roiled up about the graduate school and about the universities.
Nestle, Georgia, go ahead, please.
Yes, I
Hello,
would ask
Nestle.
a question in relation to Woodrow Wilson's connection with the Ku Klux Klan. I understand from the Shillings Institute that Woodrow Wilson was the intellectual guru of the Ku Klux Klan.
That's not true.
No, that's
yeah.
much too strong.
Yeah, no, he had nothing to do with the Klan.
Did the Klan have anything to do with him? I mean,
Nope.
Nope.
How aware were people back in those days of his attitude toward the races?
Depends on who you're talking to.
I would say they were very aware. And he was not sort of mainstream, but I think the thing to realize about the time that we're talking about, as today actually, that if one is a white American, you can be anti-black or and not so much anti-Semitic, but anti a lot of things without it percolating into the public persona.
Yeah.
So, for instance, when prominent white figures make racist remarks, it still rarely becomes news.
Let's go back to the beginning and kind of, between the two of you, bring everybody up to date on Woodrow Wilson. Let's start at the very beginning. Where did he live? I know he's born here. Where did he live?
Moved to Augusta, Georgia, because that's where his father got a church. Then his father goes on to Columbia, South Carolina, where he's on the faculty of the seminary there. Wilson goes off to Davidson College for a year, comes back, then goes to Princeton after that, graduates from Princeton, spends about a year and a half at UVA Law School, leaves without taking a degree, practices law for a couple of years down in Atlanta. Decides that's not for him. He goes to graduate school at Johns Hopkins, spends about 3 years there, teaches at Bryn Mawr for 2 years, another 3 years at Wesleyan in Connecticut, then is a professor at Princeton for 12 years, and then president of Princeton for 8 years after that, elected governor of New Jersey in 1910, elected president in 1912, 2 terms as president, lives not quite 3 years after his presidential term is over.
Elected in 1912, had he ever run for office besides
He'd run for governor.
That was all?
Yeah.
And the election, then we talked about it earlier, we calculated only something between 14 and 15 million votes in a country that had 100 million people. Mm-hmm. Who couldn't vote then?
Most people couldn't vote.
That's right.
Women couldn't vote. Black people couldn't vote unless they were in northern cities, and the great majority of American black people were still in the South. Immigrants mostly couldn't vote, but it would depend on what city you were in and the state of the democratic machine in that city. And a lot of people didn't vote because they were very mobile, so they moved around, they get laid off, they would move somewhere else to find another job, never established residency. So voting was very much a narrow privilege at the time.
He married how many times?
2. His first wife died right at the beginning of the First World War. Not quite 2, a little over 2 years after that, he married again, and was his widow survived him. She
died
in
how many
1961.
children?
3 children, all daughters.
Let's go to what we call our education phoner. We always talk to someone in the United States that either teaches or goes to a school named after the person that we're featuring. And this program, the 28th president, our 27th program, because Grover Cleveland was president twice and we only did one program on him, is Steve Vada, or Veda, we'll find out how he pronounces his name, Wilson Junior High School in Hamilton, Ohio. Steve, how do you pronounce your last name?
Good morning. That is Steve Vada.
Vada. And how old are you?
I'm 51. This is...
Oh, you're a teacher. I'm sorry.
Teaching is my second career, actually. I'm a carpenter by trade, and I went back to school at the age of 40, and I'm a newer teacher.
What do you teach?
I'm a social studies teacher, and specifically this year I'm teaching 9th grade civics.
Do the kids that you teach know who Woodrow Wilson was?
Yes, because I include that in my civics programs to give them a little sense of the heritage of their school.
Do you have any idea why they named the junior high school there after Woodrow Wilson?
Well, way back in 1909, the Hamilton School Board decided to start naming all of the schools within the district after presidents. And when Wilson was opened in 1934, then they just happened to be at Wilson, so it became Woodrow Wilson.
What are some of the other names they use there in the community?
Let's see. The junior highs are George Washington and Lincoln, and then some of the others are, let's see, Garfield and Buchanan, Harrison, Grant, Fillmore, on and on.
Chester A. Arthur?
We have 14 elementary schools. I don't think you want me to name them all.
Why did you go from being a carpenter to a teacher? What triggered your interest?
Well, I've always had a love of history, and I've always loved working with young people. And number three, my back started giving me problems. So I needed to find a profession that that I didn't have to do all that heavy lifting anymore.
Where is the community of Hamilton, Ohio located?
We're about 30 miles north of Cincinnati.
How big are you?
The town, Hamilton, is about 60,000 population.
Do you have any idea whether or not Hamilton was named after Alexander Hamilton?
No, I don't. No, I don't.
And what do you think of Woodrow Wilson as a president? What's your own opinion?
Well, I think he was an excellent president. Of course, I think he's wound up being noted most of all for not being able to convince the Senate to ratify the peace treaty and get the United States to join the League of Nations.
Steve Vada, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
You're very welcome.
We have been also delinquent in not giving you the telephone number for teachers to join our C-SPAN in the Classroom American Presidents Series program. And so we're going to take a little bit of time so that you can get your pencil and pen out and write this number down and call us. We have folks at C-SPAN to take your call, and they want to hear from you either through the web at cspan.org/classroom or via telephone at 202-626-4858. And this is a setup for materials free of charge to be used in your classrooms. In regard to our American Presidents series, we also have an American Presidents website that you can go into and find lesson plans and other materials that you can use. Posters are going to be available, timelines, ways for you to use what we've been able to bring to you via television into the classroom. And then your students can even go back to the website and pull up all of this information, all the audio and video on the website from the past presidential program series will be there for a long time to come so that you can use it in the classroom and students can also study it. It's AmericanPresidents.org. It's 202-626-4858 as we take a call from Providence, Rhode Island. Providence, Rhode Island, go ahead, please.
Hi. Is this on at night, too?
It's
Brian?
on every Friday night at 8 o'clock.
Okay.
East Coast time.
I love this. This is such a great program, the president. I have two questions. I think Woodrow Wilson was a good president and a very moral president, and how he was torn between World War I and his peace. I just wanted to know about two questions. One was The Birth of a Nation, the movie that showed the Ku Klux Klan in a good way, and I heard he had a private showing of it, and in the 20s, how the KKK became really popular. And I don't think that he endorsed the movie, but I just wanted to know a little information about that. And the second question is, I don't understand why, why, like, some people don't like Wilson. They say that he's Wilsonian, like Pat Buchanan and these other right-wing nuts. That what was wrong with having a League of Nations and having a, which was the forerunner to the UN, and what was like having peace and this? I mean, he had, I think he was just, the ideas were right. Maybe the time wasn't. Hopefully
Thanks, Nell Painter.
Thank you.
D.W. Griffith's movie?
Yeah, he did have a private showing of Birth of a Nation, and he did approve of it. It was a tremendously popular movie, and in fact, I talked in a program at the New York Historical Society a few years ago, and a man came up to me and said that he was in school in New York City in the 1920s, and his whole class was marched down to watch Birth of a Nation as though it were a documentary on the Civil War and Reconstruction. This is New York City in the 1920s. So it was tremendously popular, and the film is still shown as a triumph of movie making, as a technological feat, as if it had no content. The content itself is absolutely atrocious, and if you've seen it, you know well. And it's stunning to think that this kind of hate-mongering could be so popular in our country and continue to be so popular. Several films were made to counter that. Booker T. Washington actually started a movie called Birth of a Race, and I don't know if that one is even extant. I wish that we could see that one sort of beside Birth of a Nation as well.
Professor Cooper, what's wrong with the League of Nations?
Nothing. It should have worked. What was wrong with it was that the powers that went into it, we didn't go in. The powers that did go into it and dominate it weren't willing to put real teeth into it, to use it the way it was supposed to be used. Something interesting, the caller mentioned that Pat Buchanan and others, and he's not the only one, use Wilsonian almost as a sneer and an epithet. What they mean by that usually is unrealistic idealism, sweeping promises, and things like that, which frankly, I think is a real distortion of Woodrow Wilson. He can be viewed that way, but I think it's wrong when you view him that way. The other thing I think is interesting is, of these presidential giants, he is the only one who I think really remains terribly controversial. Sooner or later, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt will sort of be brought up that everybody loves them, maybe not for the right reasons, but they somehow become icons and non-controversial. That has not happened with Woodrow Wilson.
Everyone should notice in passing that Dr. Cooper has on his, is it black and orange?
And black.
Black
yes.
and orange,
Yeah.
the colors of Princeton. Let's go to Chicago, Illinois next.
Good morning. How are you?
Welcome.
My question is to both professors. Both of them said he had no direct dealing with the Klan. That would be untrue. Miss Painter's position dates is from late 1877 to his time. They tried to get rid of the Ku Klux Klan, McKinley. When Wilson took over, that second group of Klansmen was so notorious that they lynched people on the weekend. That question about Jews, they didn't only lynch blacks, they lynched Jews also.
Oh, Leo
But
Frank.
that's not being brought out in your conversation. And I think it's disingenuous not to say that he had no involvement with the Klan. If he approved of the movie, what more involvement do you need?
Well, when we say that he had no connection to the Klan, we mean personally, and certainly what the Klan stood for intellectually would have been anathema to Woodrow Wilson. But he was a person, he was a white supremacist, let's put it that way. But there are lots and lots of different ways of being white supremacists. If you're a white supremacist, you don't have to be in the Klan. And he felt that white people were better and smarter, and that doesn't make him a Klansman. You're absolutely right that lynching was rampant during his time, The Leo Frank case occurred while Woodrow Wilson was president in 1915.
What's that?
Leo Frank was a Jewish businessman in Atlanta, and he was charged and convicted of the murder of one of the workers in the pencil factory where he was the superintendent. The case got to be a cause célèbre, and one of the leading populists, Thomas Watson, got involved and in very anti-Semitic terms drummed up opposition to Leo Frank. Leo Frank was convicted. There was a tremendous upwelling of outrage over this conviction, and the governor finally pardoned him, but a group of vigilantes came. They called themselves the Knights of Mary Phagan, Mary Phagan being the name of the victim, took him out and lynched him. And we have photographs of Leo Frank lynched.
Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, our next call. We're talking about Woodrow Wilson. Go ahead, please.
Yes, my concern pretty much echoes the concerns of the past couple of callers. I wanted to ask Professor Painter if she had ever actually seen that movie, Birth of a Nation, and I agree pretty much with the previous caller that when the president has private showings of that type of movie and, you know, pretty much condones that type of movie, if we can agree that there was nothing in the content of that film that was positive about the nation or blacks or anything, how could you adamantly sit on television and say he had nothing to do with the Klan? And the other thing that needs to be brought out is this was always a secret society. I mean, even now, today, as we speak, there was a gentleman that was dragged by a truck in Texas, and there isn't one black member of that jury today in 1999.
Yes, in the current
you
jury.
Condone movies like Birth of a Nation and say, well, it's okay because he was president, but he wasn't really out-and-out Klansman.
No, I'm not saying it's okay. I'm saying that he wasn't a Klansman. And I think it's really important to understand different ways of being white supremacist in this country. White supremacy is one of the traditional values of the United States, if you wish. But if we're going to get people past it, we have to understand all the different ways of being it. And so to lump everybody together as a Klansman, I think is taking the lazy way out.
Dr. Cooper, how many constitutional amendments were passed during his time?
2. Prohibition, which he did not support, and women's suffrage, which he belatedly supported.
Very belatedly.
Yeah.
How belated was his support?
In 1912, Theodore Roosevelt endorsed women's suffrage. Woodrow Wilson did not. In fact, there's not much difference between the two of them because Theodore Roosevelt was very lukewarm in his support and Wilson was kind of lukewarm in his opposition. 2 of his daughters, in fact, were suffragists and used to give their father the devil of a time over dinner. In 1916, he came around and endorsed nationwide women's suffrage. That's one of his campaign planks. He voted for it in a referendum in New Jersey, which failed, unfortunately. He backs off a bit during World War I. He's saying to the suffragists, kind of cool it, we got a war to fight. They keep pressing him, and finally he comes around, and in 1918 he gave a very impressive speech in support of the amendment, which was one of the things that helped finally put it over.
Who did he run against in 1916?
Charles Evans Hughes, later Republican Secretary of State, and then from 1930 to 1941, Chief Justice of the United States.
And had been on the court, though, got off to run.
Got off the court to run, that's correct.
Orangeburg, South Carolina, you're on with Professor Cooper and Professor Painter. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, good morning, Brian. This is a great series.
Morning.
Woodrow Wilson waved at me when I was about 6 years old. My grandfather used to walk me all over Washington. He was a great walker. And we were walking up S Street, and this limousine was in front of the Wilson house, which I've been through since then, and it's a wonderful museum to go through on S Street in Washington. And his wife was helping him in the back of the car. They used to take invalids like him around and ride around so that it was an outing for them. They could look at the buildings and all. And long, pale face. And I guess Ms. Wilson said, "Oh, Woodrow, there's a cute little boy with an old man there waved to him, and this little hand came up, and he sort of limply waved at me, and I waved back, and it became sort of a family joke. My grandmother, Anna Jane DeMent Mattingly, was a fanatical admirer of Woodrow Wilson, worked hard for the United Nations and all that sort of thing. You know, William Buckley collects these trivia things. Shakespeare had a vocabulary of 25,000 words, and Woodrow Wilson, in his 5-volume History of the United States, which I have a copy of, used 12,000 words, which is more vocabulary than any author except Shakespeare, according to William Buckley, and we all know that Buckley is always right. So
thanks, caller. Thanks very much for joining us this morning. Let me go back to that time period where, what was the year that he had the stroke when he was in office? 1918.
1919.
1919.
Right after that speaking tour on behalf of the League of Nations.
How long was the war itself, World War I?
World War I ends on November 11th, 1918.
And how many people did we lose in that war?
Over 100,000.
How many? Do you happen to know how many people we committed to the war?
We had 2,000 troops in France by the time the war ended. We had raised an army of 5 million.
We have some video of a tour that Woodrow Wilson had in 1918 over Europe. What was that?
Oh, sorry.
Do you know this trip?
What he did was, he's the first president really to leave the United States while in office. Theodore Roosevelt had technically left it because he went down to, technically not left it, sorry, because he made one brief trip down to inspect the building of the Panama Canal. After the armistice, Wilson made this very controversial decision to attend the peace conference himself and to head the American delegation. And in fact, from December 1918 to the beginning of July 1919, with the exception of one month-long trip back, he's out of the country the entire time. He's heading the U.S. delegation to the Paris Peace Conference.
Next call, Harriman, New York. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning. I'm curious which former presidents would have been alive during the Wilson administration, and did they know the Wilsons personally, and would they have had any influence on social, domestic, or foreign policy issues? Similarly, how Eisenhower, Nixon, and Carter had been involved in politics after their term.
Okay, there are only two living ex-presidents during Wilson's presidency, Roosevelt and Taft. Roosevelt dies early in 1919. Neither of them had Roosevelt had a great influence on Wilson in the sense that Wilson is trying to outbid him as a progressive. In other words, he's trying to, they're both fighting for the same electorate, the same ideas. Taft is a conservative, although Taft was a great supporter of the League of Nations, so that there's a kind of bipartisan foreign policy there for a while.
Let's go to Los Angeles. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm interested in Woodrow Wilson's interest in art. I understand that his first wife was an accomplished artist, and that he spent many summers when he was the president of the university at Princeton in Oldham, Connecticut, as part of the art colony at Oldham, Connecticut, in the Griswold House. And that as president, he returned there later to introduce his second wife to some of the people who were there at the art colony.
Thanks for the call. There's some there's a piece of art, I know at least one of, I think Ellen's, his first wife's
in the Wilson House
museum,
in Washington. Yes,
but they're here I think. Yeah. Maybe we can pick that up.
Yeah.
Do either one of you know much about the...
She was an accomplished artist. Interestingly enough, she was also a very good architect. And the one house they built together is one house that's not a President Wilson site. It's the one in Princeton on Library Place. Lovely house. They built that together. They went to Old Lyme. I think they actually started when he was a professor at Princeton, before he's president. And then later, when he was president of the U.S., they went up to Cornish, New Hampshire, which is where Augustus St. Gaudens had his studio up there.
Professor Painter, back to the war again. At what point did the country know that this man had had a stroke?
Oof. I will defer to Professor Cooper to that.
The rumors start almost immediately afterward. His doctors never officially confirmed that he had a stroke. I think it's even doubtful that Wilson ever admitted or anybody ever told him he'd had a stroke. The news comes out, really. Some of his doctors, attending physicians, specialists who'd come in, let the information out in February 1920, which confirms what people have been thinking for a long time. So that's when the consciousness sets in.
But as we talked earlier, he had a stroke in 1896 when he was around 40.
Well, there are questions about that. That's controversial. He'd had certainly some kind of episode right about 40 in 1896. Then about 10 years later, when he is president of Princeton, he wakes up one morning blind in one eye from some kind of either hemorrhage or blockage there. And then there are various other things while he's president, nothing very big. At one point while he's at the peace conference, he gets very sick. Some people claim that was a small stroke. Others argue that was kind of influenza with brain involvement.
Cincinnati, Ohio, you're next.
Hello. I want to thank you, Brian, for this wonderful series on your 20th anniversary. I am using your C-SPAN series to teach senior citizens at the University of Cincinnati. I'm not a teacher. We do this as a volunteer for the Institute for Learning and Retirement. But my question to your two guests is, how smart should a president be? There's an article in the Current American Heritage by Richard Brookhiser.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting article, and I just wondered if either one of you had read it, or if you had any comment to the suggestion that sometimes the presidents are too smart for the country's good.
Caller, before Nell Painter answers that, how many of your senior citizens are involved in this, and how are they using the series?
Well, this is a new class that I got together when I started watching your program in the spring, and I suggested it to the curriculum committee, and they thought it was a good idea. And so we have almost 1,000 students, so I don't know how many will sign up. Our series begins on September the 30th. It runs for 8 weeks, and I'm using your material. I have just thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm going to use presidents that most people, well, myself, the ones that I didn't know anything about, or little.
Please keep us informed on how that's going. It'd be fun to maybe even come out and have a chance to talk to some of your students out there and what they're learning. Nell Painter, how smart does a president have to be?
Brookhiser notes that Theodore Roosevelt was very well educated and was an author, and that Woodrow Wilson was terribly well educated and he was an author, and Taft was well educated and he was an author. I don't remember if he also speaks about, the 1916.
Hughes? Or?
Yeah, Charles Evan Hughes. But Hughes had been a Supreme Court justice. He's very learned. So here we have all these very knowing people, and we still have this sort of bumbling around a little bit. And even terribly smart Woodrow Wilson ends up being very rigid about the League of Nations and not getting what he wanted. And so perhaps there's being too smart. I think it's a very good thing that Woodrow Wilson was not only a very perceptive man, but also very well educated, because he was, all of them were involved in the United States at a point when the United States was moving from a very insular kind of interned national life to being active on a world stage. And if they had been small bore leaders, if they had been people who were bogged down in the minutiae of local politics or state politics or even political advantage, I think the United States, the character of the United States as a world leader would have been severely compromised. So I think it's a good thing that Woodrow Wilson was as well educated and savvy as he was.
Wilmington, Delaware, next.
Yes, my question has to do with Wilson's speaking tour regarding the League of Nations as he came back to the United States, and the reaction by Henry Cabot Lodge and the Senate towards the League of Nations. I know that Lodge filibustered in the Senate by, actually reading the entire Treaty of Versailles and so forth. And I wonder, what Wilson's relationship was with Lodge and with the Senate, and why it was so difficult for them to accept the League of Nations. And I just wanted you to elaborate maybe more fully
on. Let me say a couple of things. The tour, first of all, is perhaps a desperation measure on Wilson's part because he feels stymied. The Senate is stalemating him there, really. Lodge claimed, by the way, by reading the treaty, he wasn't doing anything unusual, but the relations between Wilson and Lodge are terrible, quite simply. They have not been on speaking terms since 1916. Lodge also sees himself as the surrogate, the heir to his great departed friend Theodore Roosevelt. The real issue, as Nels pointed out before on this program, is how much sovereignty are we going to be compromising by being in the League? Are we going to be committing ourselves to sending troops overseas, maybe to very faraway places where we don't think we have much interest? That's what Lodge wants to safeguard against. So he and other Republican senators put through a series of reservations, which are really limitations on American membership in the League. And the quarrel between him and Wilson is how much should our membership be limited?
If you've just tuned in and wonder what this is all about, we're featuring the 28th President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, who was born in this house right behind us here, spent about a year here and moved on to Augusta, Georgia. Became president in 1912, was elected again in 1916. In 1912, beat two presidents, William Howard Taft and Theodore Roosevelt, who came back and actually beat the incumbent president, a man who was responsible for getting him in the job in the first place. Well, we're getting more complicated here, but anyway, we're going to be here for the next half hour or so, or 45 minutes, and continue to take your calls, and also we'll go to the museum in a moment to find out what they have here in case you want to come to Stanton, Virginia, which is about 2.5 to 3 hours south of Washington, over on the other side of the Blue Ridge Mountains in the Shenandoah Valley. We go to Memphis, Tennessee next. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Brian.
Morning.
I am thoroughly enjoying your series. I have not missed a single one so far. It's very educational. I wanted to ask the professors this morning about the failure of the League of Nations. The plan within itself was fundamentally sound, and I wanted to know, did President Wilson have trouble with the Senate? Did he have trouble with the Congress? Did he have trouble with the United States within itself? Or was it, I just want to know, why did it fail? My great-grandmother was born in 1890, and she didn't die until 1995. And I had the privilege of spending the last 27 years of her life with her daily. So she was a walking history book. And she said that, prior to World War I, the relations with Europe were bad. Our relations were good in a way, but they were bad, And she said because the League of Nations failed, that's what caused the United States to have to fight World War II and World War I. So I really wanted for you all to elaborate on the failure of the League of Nations. And I thank you.
Thank you.
Let me get started with this, and then we'll turn it over to John Cooper. Woodrow Wilson didn't quite do his political homework in the sense that he didn't build a groundswell in. So he went over pretty much by himself. And even though it was very important work that he was doing in the negotiations in Paris, there was a lot going on in the United States at the same time. And the thing that stands out for me is inflation. That's something we still understand. And so he did not have the interest or the really committed support of large numbers of American people at the time, because he was not attending to domestic issues. Plus, he did not have bipartisan support. He didn't take Republicans over with him. He didn't take Henry Cabot Lodge with him to Paris. I don't know if he could have taken Lodge with him, but he did not take high-ranking Republicans with him. So in a sense, Woodrow Wilson wrapped himself in the League and made the League his thing. Now, after that, there's a whole set of world issues that are going on. And I don't know if it could have turned out any better than it did, certainly by 1939.
Let me ask you about the League of Nations and the vote. When did it come in the Senate?
two different sets of votes. One is in November 1919, the other is in March 1920. In November 1919, they had votes for it both with lodges reservations and with no reservations. And what happens is there's a small group of senators who are true isolationists called irreconcilables.
Are they all Republicans?
All but two. 2 Democrats and 12 Republicans. On one vote for the lodge reservations, the Democrats and the irreconcilables vote against it. On the other one, the Republicans and the irreconcilables vote against it with no reservations. Either way, it doesn't get 2/3. You have to have 2/3 in the Senate for consent to a treaty. On the second vote, the sentiment of the country for compromise and getting into the League somehow has grown so strong that despite Wilson's rigidity and his insistence, no, my terms or none, which I think really is heavily influenced by that stroke. I mean, really, things could have been different if he hadn't had that stroke. How different's a good question. On that vote, half the Democrats deserted him. They came very close. They came within 7 votes of getting 2/3. Now, Wilson had threatened, if that happened, to refuse to ratify. By the way, one of my pet peeves is the Senate does not ratify a treaty. A president ratifies a treaty. The Senate gives advice and consent. Wilson would have refused to ratify. We would not have gone into the League then, but I think that would have tied the hands of the Republicans to take us in when they won.
Dana Point, California. Go ahead, please. Hello, Dana Point. You're on the air. Dana Point, California. Are you there?
Yes, I am.
Please speak up.
Here. Yes, I'd like to say, Brian, how much I enjoy the program. I've been listening to it since the beginning. Certainly time well spent. I'd like to ask the professors about President Wilson's somewhat idealistic approach to trying to get the League of Nations put through and his attendance at the Versailles Peace Conference. It seemed to me, in what I've read, that the attendance at the Peace Conference probably was not a good idea, and that was one of the major reasons why the League of Nations wasn't passed. That President Wilson went to the Peace Conference with a idealistic approach at trying to get his agenda put through, whereas Lloyd George and Clemenceau went to the Peace Conference with very concise, definite plans for their country's agenda, and that actually Lloyd George put through a lot of measures that, in effect, were counter to what Wilson really wanted to accomplish. But for some reason, he didn't quite understand or didn't follow up on those issues. And
thanks for the call. Let me ask for you to set up the circumstances of the. Was the actual conference in Paris or in Versailles?
The conference is in Paris. They signed the treaty in Versailles. They signed it in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. Wilson goes over. I think actually it's a criticism of him that he believed he needed to go because he didn't believe that anybody else, he couldn't have a trusted lieutenant who would represent his peace program. I think that's a weakness of Wilson's, but his vision of peace is not going to get through, he believes, unless he goes. The big question, of course he compromised. Of course he compromised in the peace treaty. The question is how much. Again, I still stand with Winston Churchill, who said he's impressed with how much Wilson got, not how little. On the terms of the failure, I think Nell put it very well just a minute or two ago when she said he hadn't done his homework. His homework in selling the League to the people. That speaking tour of his in September 1919 is a measure of desperation. What he's trying to do is an awful lot of public education, a lot of catch-up ball. It's not too little too late. He's trying to do too much too late.
Who was at that Paris Peace Conference? What countries?
France, Italy, Britain, of course.
Yep.
This is such an obvious question. It's so hard.
Germany?
No, the Germans aren't. That was the issue. The issue was originally they planned it that first the Allies would get together, the winners would get together, state their terms, then they would invite the Germans and there would be a further conference. Well, it proved so hard and so fractious and so time-consuming that they short-circuited the second part of it and just gave it to the Germans.
And Germany also was falling apart, and the Russians were not there either.
Was the war over?
Yes, the armistice.
Yeah.
There was an armistice.
The war itself is over. There's all kinds of conflict going on in Eastern Europe and in other places.
How long did the actual conference last?
6 to 7 months.
And how long was Wilson there?
He's there continually, except for one trip he had to make home to sign bills and laws at the end of Congress in February and March 1919.
Mount Vernon, Missouri, you're next.
Yes, I want to address a question to Dr. Cooper. I want to know how the 25th Amendment would have affected Woodrow Wilson's stroke situation, whether Wilson would have given up power. I'll listen to your answer here.
That's a very, very good question indeed. If there's any president, first of all, for whom the 25th Amendment should have been applied, to whom it should have been applied, it's Wilson. I mean, clearly this man should have been removed, preferably voluntarily, from the presidency. He wasn't. Unfortunately, there is some question. You'd think, oh, well, obviously now the 25th Amendment protects us. There's some question that even in that extreme, the 25th Amendment is not as strong and good a protection against presidential disabilities as it's supposed to be.
We're going to go to George Norris in a moment, who is in the museum, but first let's call from Longbridge, New Jersey. You're next.
Yes, I'm calling from Longbridge, which is in Monmouth County, New Jersey. And as I call, I'm looking out over the ocean and the Seven Presidents Park, which is the only county oceanfront park in the entire United States. And it's named after the 7 presidents who have vacationed here. In 1916, Woodrow Wilson waited to see if he was reelected at the Shadow Lawn, which is now Monmouth University. And I was wondering about all the other presidents who vacationed here. There hasn't been a great deal of information about what they did while they were here and how it might have affected it.
Caller, who are the other 6?
Pardon?
Who are the other 6 presidents that go to Long Branch, New Jersey?
Oh, it's President Grant, Hayes, Garfield died here.
That's right.
And then we were followed by, I guess, Harrison, and, well, Wilson was the last one.
And is there any commemoration there in the community?
Yes, right on the ocean there is a park with the statue of Garfield, a life-size statue of him, and then 6 monuments on either side of the statue that gives the dates and the names and the times of the presidents who were here.
Thanks for calling. Either one of you been there?
No, I just know of Long Branch, and I know it is Long Branch. But I have not visited, and I don't know what the other presidents did while they were there. Probably nothing, and they probably don't want us to know.
Garfield died there. Garfield died there. I think that's the other important thing.
George Norris is an interpreter here at the Woodrow Wilson Home and Museum, and he is in the museum area. Mr. Norris, what do you have for us this morning?
Well, Mr. Lamb, we're going to go through our Princeton gallery when you arrive here, several Wilson-related items at his time during Princeton. He's a student at Princeton from 1875 to 1879, and he returns to the faculty 1890 as a professor of jurisprudence and political economy. He serves as professor until 1902, at which time he's elected president of Princeton, and he will hold that position until 1910, at which time he's elected Democratic governor of New Jersey. Of course, 1912, the presidency, and then he's reelected in 1916. So we have many related Wilson items in this room, including his roll-top desk, his bookcase, and many, many etchings and paintings by his first wife, Ellen Axon Wilson, who was very, very important in his life.
George Norris, we seem to have technical problems at the moment, and so rather than let you show us things, let me go to the phones, and at least we can do some audio here in the interim, and we'll find out in a moment what's wrong. Let's go to Stowe, Vermont. You're our next caller, Stowe. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good job, Brian. Good job, C-SPAN. As I understand it, the communist movement was underway during that period of time. And I'm curious, the Bolshevik Revolution took place, and during that period, what was the mood in the country, and what was the administration's attitude towards what's going on over there?
Thanks. Nell Painter?
2 Russian revolutions in 1917. The first one, the Menshevik Revolution, more moderate, with a good deal of American support for those people who were looking out for that sort of thing. The Bolshevik Revolution, however, the October Revolution, was a real revolution, a bloody revolution, and scared a lot of people. And so we can't talk about communists until that point. There were plenty of other kinds of radicals, like the industrial workers of the world, who were more syndicalists. That is, well, I won't bog you down in the various left groups, but let's just say that the Bolshevik Revolution scared a lot of people.
If you've just tuned in, you don't see a live picture on. There you go. We're back. Whatever was going wrong is now being fixed for the moment. Let's go to Lake Mills, Wisconsin. Go ahead, please.
I too want to thank you for your wonderful series. As a family genealogist, I found that I have common ancestors with 18 presidents.
That's a lot.
What?
That's a lot.
Yes, it is. And I don't have one with Woodrow Wilson. But what I wanted to ask, are you people listening familiar with the book Genealogies of American Presidents by Gary Boyd Roberts? It was published in 1998. It has.
And how big a book is it?
It's just an ordinary book, and it has the genealogies of all of the American presidents, and it has I hear people ask, is this president related to any other president? And in the index, there are 48 pages of beautifully drawn charts showing how presidents are related to each other, or who their common ancestor is, all the way from comparing 2 presidents up to 5 presidents, showing their common ancestors.
Well, thanks for calling us with that idea. I think we've had others who've seen this book and suggested that we get it, and I'll check with our overall executive producer, Mark Farkas, and see if we can't do something on that book. Let's go back to George Norris, who's once again in the museum. Go back through what you were telling us earlier. Give us a setup on what the Woodrow Wilson Museum is about.
We are located right now in our Princeton Gallery, and this particular gallery concentrates on President Wilson's years at Princeton University. Of course, while he's a student at Princeton, or the College of New Jersey, from 1875 to 1879. He returns to Princeton in 1890 as a professor. He's on the faculty as a professor of jurisprudence and political economy. He serves as professor until 1902, at which time he's elected president of Princeton, and he holds that position until 1910, at which time he's elected Democratic governor of New Jersey, 1912, first election, and then he's reelected in 1916. So Wilson truly goes straight from academia right into politics, and within 2 years he's in the White House. So that was quite unusual. Many Wilson items in this room. Our first piece is a shorthand book over on the left wall. That particular book was based on Andrew Jackson Graham's shorthand method, which Wilson was familiar with. He saw that method in the November 1872 edition of Frank Leslie Boys and Girls Weekly. He would use the shorthand method throughout his academic career, primarily as lecture notes. And as president, what he would do is transpose and get his thoughts collected. He would write in shorthand, and then generally he would transpose to the typewriter. His first published book, Congressional Government, 1895, is his doctoral thesis. He's the only U.S. president to have received a PhD from Johns Hopkins University in 1886. This particular book concentrates on a British parliamentary system as opposed to the American presidency. After the Civil War, Wilson is quite disillusioned with the leadership in this country, primarily presidents like Johnson, Grant, Garfield, and so forth. As we move to the left wall, the bookcase that we see in the corner there, quite unusual. President Wilson uses the royalties from his book, Congressional Government, to buy this bookcase. On the wall, we have several etchings by his first wife, Ellen Axon, who was quite talented. The one to the right is the Anglo philosopher Edmund Burke, whose reflections on the French Revolution had a profound impact on Wilson. In the middle, we have Joseph Ruggles Wilson, probably the most important influence in the president's life. And as we scan to the corner, we have the Prime Minister, William Gladstone, again, another major influence in Wilson's life. To my right, we have a view of Princeton University. Well, I've already mentioned that Wilson is a student at the College of New Jersey from 1875 to 1879, and professor and president, very popular professor actually. His lectures were usually filled to capacity. In the corner, we have some of Ellen Axon's paintings, and as you notice, her paintings are done in the Impressionist style. She was a very, very talented lady.
George, hold on. Let me take a call, and we'll look at that painting that you talked about, and we'll ask you more about it as we go to Sarasota, Florida. Sarasota, thanks for waiting. What's on your mind?
Well, good morning. I'm calling, in a way, on a lighter note, but I've noticed you've been talking about the effect on his presidency of his stroke. The reason I'm calling is my grandfather, Arthur N. Davis, wrote a book called The Kaiser as I Know Him. He had been the American dentist to the royal court in Germany, and when hostilities broke out in 1917, suddenly became an enemy alien, and he and my mother came back to this country, and he was asked to the White House to meet with Wilson and explain what he could about the motivations of the Kaiser and of the German military staffs and so forth. But he passed on to me, my grandfather did, an odd comment. He said that the Treaty of Versailles, Woodrow Wilson had, during the negotiations, had been horribly tormented by his feet, that tight shoes had put him in severe pain, and that Lloyd George and the other participants in the conference, Clemenceau and so forth, knew this. I just wonder if anyone had ever heard that Wilson had sort of been held captive by his feet.
You ever heard that, George Norris?
No, sir, I've never heard that at all. I've heard other things, but that's a new one for me.
Professor Cooper?
That's a new one on me, too.
No painter shaking her head. Show us some more. Tell us more about those paintings that his first wife painted in what year? Do you know, George Norris?
No, sir, I'm not sure exactly what year. She painted throughout her lifetime, and as I mentioned, they're very similar, close to fresh Impressionist style. The one that's on the easel is actually the one that I'm most familiar with. When Wilson is professor and president at Princeton, this is Prospect. And apparently, from what I understand and have read, Ellen did the landscaping at the back grounds, and this is the painting that she did of that. It's quite beautiful.
She did the out here where we are?
No, at Princeton.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that part. Yeah.
She had quite a hand in re-landscaping the backgrounds, and this particular painting is of that. Quite beautiful, the colors.
Again, what year did his first wife die?
Ellen dies of Bright's disease, August 1914 in the White House.
What is Bright's disease? Does anybody know?
Well,
it's a kidney. Sorry, go ahead, George.
It's a kidney ailment. Actually, at that time, they referred to it, I believe, as tuberculosis of the kidneys.
What else do you have in that part of the museum?
Well, we have some of Wilson's books to my left. As you know, the president was quite a scholar. Would frown, I think, a little bit on that term, but he wrote nearly 17 books. I've already mentioned congressional government. The year he's elected president of Princeton, 1902, he writes his 5-volume history of the American people. He wrote a popular biography on George Washington in 1896, although the critics weren't too thrilled with it. Most feel that the only thing worthwhile out of the book were the Howard Pyle illustrations that were there. He wrote books on the Civil War, mostly domestic policies, things like that. And our final case in the room actually shows the president's candlestick telephone, which is quite unusual. And we have his pince-nez glasses in the case there. All of these items, as I mentioned in the manse, were donated primarily by Edith Bowling Wilson, his second wife.
We're going to take a call. Stay where you are, George Norris. We go to Houston, Texas. Go ahead, please. Houston, are you there?
Yes, hello.
Hi.
I'd like to go back to the lynching that occurred in Georgia of Leo Frank. I'm a native Georgian, although I'm now living in Houston. And I'd like some help in remembering Leo Frank was convicted of killing a young worker on the testimony of 2 janitors and was sentenced to die. His sentence was commuted by the then governor of Georgia, John Slayton, and commuted to life imprisonment. Governor Slayton said he didn't know whether the man did it or didn't, but he did know that he did not have a fair trial and thus commuted his sentence to life imprisonment. and then had to be escorted. The governor had to be escorted out of the state by the Georgia National Guard to South Carolina and was not allowed back in the state until 1949. At some point in the late 70s or early 80s, one of these two witnesses on his deathbed confessed that one of the two janitors actually did the murder. I'm not really sure which one, and I was wondering if Ms. Painter could help me out.
Let's see, I don't know if I'll remember the name of the janitor, but it seems to me the explanation came in two steps. One was a young boy who had witnessed the aftermath of the crime, and then afterwards there was a confession, I think. But at any rate, it was very clear that one of the witnesses, one of the most important witnesses, who was a black man, was probably the murderer. What's so interesting about that case is that at the time, everybody knew that the janitor witness was a questionable fellow who had been in trouble with the law before. But because of the way the brouhaha, all the talk around the trial, the anti-Semitism and the framing of Leo Frank, that got overlooked. I mean, this is another example of sort of the complexity of racism in our country, that the prosecutor was very happy to use this man who you would normally think be a likely suspect. So yes, it was a miscarriage of justice in several ways.
We have about 20 minutes to go. If you've just tuned in, we've been doing this for about 2 hours and 40 minutes. And I want to thank Pat Clark, who is the director here, and his staff at the Woodrow Wilson birthplace. Something like an arrival of 20 of our people on our big school bus and all kind of disrupts things for a while. And they've been very thoughtful and very helpful to us. Frank Osella, who is also on the staff of the Woodrow Wilson House, runs it in Washington, D.C., which is available for tours on S Street. And our local cable system here, Adelphia, as we go to Sacramento, California for our next call. Go ahead, please.
Good morning.
Morning.
I have a question about the Treaty of Versailles. I know, if I recall, it wasn't consented by the Senate. Was there another treaty negotiated with Germany after their defeat with the United States?
Dr. Cooper, thank you.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The problem is the United States never ratified the Treaty of Versailles. So how do we get out of the war? What happened was we had a separate treaty. After the Harding administration comes in, they negotiate another treaty which is exactly the same as the Treaty of Versailles, with one exception. It does not contain the Covenant of the League of Nations.
By the way, why does Warren Harding win the next election if Woodrow Wilson has been so successful?
Well, first of all, Wilson, Nels pointed out how many domestic troubles we had. There's quite a backlash against Wilson once that people realize that he's incapacitated, and we don't have a president there, really.
Did he ever speak after he had his stroke?
Oh, yeah, his speech was unaffected. He never gave another campaign speech. He did meet with some people to make a statement in the 1920 election, and then later he did give a few very brief speeches, two of them on the radio, in fact. One of them always on Armistice Day. He'd come out, he'd hobble out to the portico of that house on S Street. He would give a brief talk on the radio, something about the armistice, and the last one was about 2 months before he died.
Petaluma, California.
Good morning. I have a question, two questions actually. The first one is, what is the relationship with the United States and England before and during the war? And then my last question is, with the Lusitania, they found that there was torpedoes on that. And did Wilson know about the shipment of arms to England at that time? I'll hang up and listen to the answers. Thank you again.
No, Painter?
Nope.
They're pointing at each other.
Let's see. Sorry. The first part of I can answer about what was the first part?
The relationship of the United States with England.
Very prickly. In fact, before the Germans used the submarine, our chief conflicts, our chief contacts with the belligerents are with the British, and the British are using their navy to blockade the continent of Europe, and that's causing some real problems. What happens then is, when the Germans start using the submarine, it's a much more inflammatory kind of thing because it kills people. The blockade doesn't kill people.
Who owned the Lusitania?
The Lusitania is a Cunard liner. It's a British liner. The Lusitania, in fact, I think I think that's incorrect that they were carrying torpedoes. They were carrying rifles. They were carrying rifles and bullets. Most British ships did carry some munitions. Yeah, we knew that the Lusitania was carrying some munitions. The point is, in sinking the Lusitania, the Germans were doing one thing more than anything else. They were killing people. The Lusitania was the largest liner afloat.
Long Island, go ahead, please.
And I have two questions. The first is, in Woodrow Wilson's early years at Princeton, he wrote numerous articles on the study of political science. One in particular was published in 1887 and was called The Study of Administration. That article was credited with creating the dichotomy between the old study of political science and the new study of public administration as a separate and distinct field of study. I was wondering if you can elaborate on that. And secondly, during the President series, I noticed that two presidents stand out as being intellectuals, John Quincy Adams and Woodrow Wilson. And I was wondering, who do you think would be probably the most intellectual presidents?
We'll take the first one.
Okay, the first one, public administration, yeah, he is credited. That article is credited with really beginning public administration as a field. You know, what happens was once a law is passed, that's not the end of it. What happens then? How is it administered? How is it carried out? Wilson's kind of the pioneer. He sets the agenda for that. On presidents as intellectuals...
Let me ask you this. Was Abraham Lincoln an intellectual?
No.
Yes. How about that? I know what Nell means, and yeah, okay.
I know what you mean.
Yeah.
Well, tell us what you mean.
Well, he was not a reader. He was not engaged in the intellectual life of his time. But he was an extremely knowing man, and he acted in a very thoughtful way. Is that?
Yeah. I would see, the way I would see it is that is a great literary artist who is not necessarily a scholar, an intellectual. And that's, by that definition, of course, Lincoln is.
Was Jack Kennedy an intellectual?
I don't think so. I think he played at it a bit.
He was well educated.
Was Thomas Jefferson an intellectual?
Oh, absolutely. Jefferson, the two Adamses, Jefferson and Madison, and then you flip forward, I think the two great intellectual presidents, really only three, we've only had three intellectual presidents in this century. Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and the third one, I think, is Herbert Hoover.
Rome, Georgia, you're next.
I think Clinton reads a lot, too.
Hello, Rome.
Rome, Georgia.
You're on the air.
I was just calling on Wilson's first wife. Her daddy was a Presbyterian minister, and I don't know whether they met in Atlanta or Augusta. And later, her dad had the Presbyterian church here in Floyd County, Rome, Georgia. And when she passed away, his first wife, she's buried here in Myrtle Hill. My mother said the day of the funeral, I had the awfulest rain here in Rome, Georgia, and we later had high waters from it. But she's buried here in Rome at the oldest cemetery in this part of the country, Myrtle Hill.
Have you ever visited her gravesite?
Oh, yeah. It's on Myrtle Hill. Sure have.
Okay. Reaction?
Wilson actually met her in Rome. It wasn't in Atlanta or Augusta. He met her in Rome. He was a young lawyer going down there on one of his few cases. He wasn't much of a lawyer, and happened to see her in church and said, "I've seen the woman I'm going to marry."
George Norris, we're going to let you go in a second, but I want to ask you, if people come to visit, other than what they've seen in the Princeton room there, what can they feast their eyes on in the Museum of Woodrow Wilson here at his home?
Well, besides that 1919 Pierce Arrow limousine that we have several galleries, a lot of Wilson memorabilia, campaign memorabilia, and in our peace room, which is our last gallery, which pretty much deals with the League of Nations, we have one of the president's cloaks in there, the very famous painting by Sir William O'Brien that's on the wall, and other related photographs after the peace conference until the time he dies in 1924. Still photographs from the funeral procession to the National Cathedral where he's buried, the only U.S. president buried in Washington,
Are you open year-round here?
Yes, sir. We're closed Thanksgiving, Christmas, and sometimes New Year's Day. So.
George Norris, thanks for
Thank you, sir. Yes,
helping us out today. We go back to the phones to Redford, Texas. Good morning.
Hello. Good morning.
Hi.
Ditto on all the compliments for this series.
Thank you.
I am of a Follett from Indiana transplanted to Texas. And I have a question about the KKK. My grandfather was a Republican, and he was also a member of the KKK, and he thought it was the greatest thing since ice cream. and he always cited as the best thing that the KKK did was there were some people in town who were living together without being married, and the KKK forced them to get married.
Yeah.
And he was kind of a small town political boss, but the contradiction that impresses me is that all of his worldview was like it was from the Southern Democrats of the time rather than Republicans, and he was such a rock-ribbed Republican. He thought Democrats were the devil.
Thorns.
Thanks for the call.
Yeah.
Dr. Cooper and Dr. Payne, what was his funeral like?
Funeral was very moving. The cathedral was just, it's not the full structure it was now. It was really just...
The National Cathedral in
the
Washington?
National Cathedral. It was in February, so it's a rather gloomy day. I mean, the description of his wife's funeral in Rome, Georgia, I think would apply there, too. It's a very moving occasion, it's a very sad occasion, because it's the sense of the prophet who had warned us and had gone to his grave without being heeded.
Why did they bury him in Washington, D.C.?
That's a good question. You know, this Presbyterian's buried in an Episcopal cathedral. I've always wondered about that, too. I think it was an idea to give him to the nation. I mean, he is, I think, the only president who stayed in Washington after that, who didn't go home somewhere. And in many ways, that's fitting, too, because Wilson had lived so many different places. He's much more, I think he's the first really modern, mobile American as a president. He's not attached to, rooted in one place.
Is Edith buried there with him, his second wife?
Yes, she is.
There she is, right there on the wall in the National Cathedral, which is in Northwest Washington. I want to ask the two of you to tell us, if somebody really wanted to go where Woodrow Wilson had been and see things that he was involved in, where they would go, how many places they'd have to visit. First, let's take this call from Irving, Texas. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Brian. I'd like more information about President Wilson's stroke while he was in the White House and the effects that his wife Edith had upon that stroke or his recovery.
How long, Dr. Cooper, was he out of sight from the American people?
4 months. He doesn't really appear in public till he takes a ride in February 1919. He's not out of the White House. He's sometimes sighted when he'll go out on the lawn or on the portico, but he's basically secluded during
Where did he have the stroke?
He had the stroke in his bedroom, which I believe is I can't swear by that. I think it's the Lincoln bedroom now. But what happened was he got up in the morning and had started suffering the stroke at night. And he was walking across the bedroom to try to get to the bathroom. And he collapsed, or he just sank down. He didn't fall, he sank down. And then Mrs. Wilson discovered this, immediately called Dr. Grayson, his personal physician. Grayson, in turn, called the country's leading neurologist, Dr. Durkin from Philadelphia, who was supposed to examine Wilson the next day, who hurried on down and examined him. But he's in seclusion for several months.
And how much, after we see him again, how long is he president?
A year. Till the end of his term, which is March 1921.
Dr. Painter, who is teaching at Princeton, where would you go if you wanted to see things Woodrow Wilson?
Well, I'd go to Princeton. Actually, you'll see a lot of Woodrow Wilson at Princeton. But I think also the house in Washington is very moving as well. What's in Augusta, Georgia?
The manse. The manse where he lived as a boy. That's a very nice site, but I swear I've got to put in a plug for our sponsors here. I think of all the Wilson sites, of anything, this does by far the most with Woodrow Wilson. Really, if you want to learn the most about him, I think this is the place to come.
Who pays for this here?
This is private. They do this themselves. They raise their own money.
And do they have any trouble keeping it going?
Have to ask them. I hope not. There's a lot of very good public-spirited citizens here at Stanton who work hard on it.
Pat Clark told me that they have 31,000 visitors in the last year, and that 5,000 of those are students, the rest adults. We go to Pleasant Hill, California. Next. Go ahead, please.
Morning.
Hi.
My question is somewhat related to the previous caller in regard to his stroke. during the last days of his administration. I was just curious who was making the decisions, who was running the country, how was work getting done while he was somewhat bedridden.
Well, first of all, this gets us back to the question of what did Mrs. Wilson do? She was very determined not to make policy decisions. In other words, she said, I'm not usurping and all of that. There were a lot of charges then that, oh, my God, yes, she's president, and horror of horrors, a female president, yeah, you know, oh, government by petticoat. What she did do was she controlled access to him, both access of people and access of issues and information. And he or she who controls access to the president, to some extent, controls the president. If there was anybody in the country, though, who was prepared to play that kind of surrogate role, she was the one. If we accept, which I don't, the idea that somebody should have been doing it that way, she was the best person in the country to do it.
He had shared with her, yes, exactly, even before they got married, what was going on. Right. So she was really very savvy.
Yeah, exactly.
We're starting to say the program producer of this stop has been Paul Brown, directed by Gary Ellenwood and Steve Carpenter. We go next to, let's see here, Oakland, California. Go ahead, please.
Good morning.
Hi.
Let's see. I have just a couple little queries here, and I was curious, could other countries join the League of Nations when it first arrived, such as Vietnam? And I was wondering, how did Wilson feel about Asians and other minorities, such as Native Americans? And how did he feel about nations, quote-unquote, third world nations seeking sovereignty?
Thanks. Could other nations join the
Yes,
league?
they did. In fact, we're the only one of the principal allies who didn't. Some of the neutrals did. Germany later joined the League of Nations. The Soviet Union joined it at one time. Vietnam was not a nation then. These are still colonies. That's a very interesting question about colonies, too, and his attitude.
What did he think of Asians?
Probably rather little, actually. But I have to say, hello, caller, you're in my hometown.
Your hometown is Pleasant Hill,
Oakland.
I'm sorry,
California.
Oakland.
Yeah. And Native Americans, he probably never gave them a single thought. Not much at all. He was bothered by the nationalist aspirations of people who had been colonized. However, he didn't just want to hand over the former German colonies to England and France. He said, we should train up the natives, so these are mandates, not colonies.
Last call, Snyder, Texas. Go ahead, please. Thanks
Good morning. I had a question, and I just wondered how you did say that he considers himself, or the United States, as the policeman of the world, and so I wondered if he ever made a public statement condemning the Armenian genocide, which happened, I guess, during his presidency.
He tried to do things about it. That's a very interesting question you ask. One of my PhDs actually did her dissertation on American policy there, and Wilson it wasn't that he was pro-Turkish, but he was very careful on that, more so probably than he should have been.
Can I ask the two of you before we say goodbye, are these books that, one of them here I have, The Warrior and the Priest, is Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, by you, John Milton Cooper, are they available?
Oh, yeah. Yep.
In the bookstore. What year did you write this?
1983.
And then the other book is by Nell Irvin Painter, which you'll put in front of it. This one is titled Standing at Armageddon, United States, 1877 to 1919. Is this available?
Uh-huh.
And what year did you write this?
That's from 1987. Standing at Armageddon is from Theodore Roosevelt.
Now, I shouldn't do this, but I should ask, this is a crazy question, did we leave anything out?
Sure, all kinds of things.
Yeah, I want to talk more about the income tax.
What would you have talked more about if we had had the time?
More about his domestic programs. Wilson really ranks with FDR and LBJ as one of the three really great, effective legislative presidents. Somebody who really got through major, major legislation.
Anything else you would have talked about?
I would talk about the income tax and the funding of the war.
Our next president is Warren Harding next week, and as you know, those who watch the show every Friday night at 8 o'clock East Coast time, these programs are rerun. Thanks to John Milton Cooper of the University of Wisconsin, 29 years there, a teacher.
Great stuff.
And Nell Irvin Painter at Princeton for the last 11 years.
Yeah.
Thank you both very much for helping us understand, and George Norris, who is the interpreter. In our last moment here on the program, once again, Ray Hoster, 30-year veteran of the United States Air Force, and 12 members of the Ovation Singers, all based here in Stanton, Virginia.
Truth and honor, you led us from day to day, and all the nations of this great world are stretching out their arms to you. When democracy has won and the strife of war is done, Woodrow Wilson, they will all remember you. Woodrow Wilson, Woodrow Wilson.
Coming up.